When my family cut me off completely 5 years ago, throwing me out into the freezing snow with absolutely nothing, I thought I would never see them again. I was wrong. Yesterday, they barged past my corporate security, interrupted my executive board meeting, and my mother slapped a stack of legal documents onto my glass conference table. She demanded I sign over 60% of my billion-dollar cybersecurity company to them, threatening to destroy my reputation and my life if I refused. What they did not know was that I had been waiting for this exact moment. My response left them absolutely paralyzed. My name is Madeline. I am 33 years old, and until yesterday, I was the family scapegoat. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who tried to tear you down. Growing up in a wealthy suburb of Chicago, the Foster household was all about appearances and conditional love. My mother Patricia and my father Richard made sure of that. I was the older sister, but my younger sister Caroline was the undisputed golden child. Whatever Caroline wanted, Caroline got. Whatever I achieved was ignored or belittled. 5 years ago, when I refused to take the fall for a terrible mistake, Caroline made my parents kicked me out. They told me I was a failure who did not belong in their prestigious family. So I left. I took my broken heart, my coding skills, and my relentless determination, and I built Aegis, a cybersecurity software platform that was currently valued at nearly $1 billion. I was sitting at the head of my glass-walled boardroom on the 40th floor of my headquarters, finalizing the details of a massive corporate merger. My top executives and two key investors were present. The atmosphere was incredibly focused and highly professional. We were discussing the final valuation numbers when the heavy double doors of the conference room flew open so violently they banged against the drywall. I stopped speaking mid-sentence. My chief financial officer actually spilled his coffee across his legal pad. Standing in the doorway looking as arrogant and entitled as she did 5 years ago was my mother, Patricia. Right behind her was my father, Richard, looking down at his expensive shoes, and my sister, Caroline, wearing a designer dress and a smug expression that made my blood boil. Trailing them was Caroline's husband, Donovan, an African-American man in a flashy, custom-tailored suit who constantly bragged about being a high-rolling venture capitalist on Wall Street. I had not seen any of them in half a decade, and they had just bypassed 3 levels of corporate security by undoubtedly bribing or manipulating my front desk staff. My mother did not even acknowledge the shocked executives sitting around the table. She marched straight up to my end of the room, her designer heels clicking aggressively against the polished hardwood floor. Without a single word of greeting, she threw a thick stack of stapled legal documents directly onto the glass table right in front of me. "Sign it, Madeline," Patricia demanded, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "We do not have all day." I stared at the documents, and then looked up at the woman who had thrown me out into the cold when I needed her most. "What exactly is this?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm, despite the adrenaline rushing through my veins. "It is a transfer of equity," my mother announced loudly, making sure every single investor and executive in the room could hear her clearly. "It transfers 60% of this company into the Foster Family Trust. It is time you paid us back for everything we sacrificed to raise you. You owe this family." A heavy silence fell over the room. My executives gasped audibly. One of the investors shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, looking between me and my hostile family members. I looked at my mother, then at Caroline, who was examining her manicured nails as if this hostile corporate takeover was just a casual afternoon errand. I watched as the people who were supposed to protect and love me stood together as a united front of greed. For 5 long years, I had worked 16-hour days. I had skipped meals, lost sleep, and sacrificed my entire personal life to build Aegis from a tiny startup into a tech empire. They had never once called to check if I was alive, if I had food to eat, or if I had a roof over my head. Now that I was on the cover of business magazines, they suddenly remembered my existence. They did not see a daughter or a sister. They only saw a walking bank account that they believed they were entitled to drain. You burst into my private corporate headquarters, interrupt a closed-door executive meeting, and demand the majority of my company, I said slowly, letting a cold smile form on my lips. You are exactly as delusional as I remember. I reached for the intercom console in the center of the table to summon the building security team and have them escorted out of the premises. But before my fingers could touch the buttons, Patricia slammed her hands flat on the glass table, leaning in so close I could smell her expensive perfume. You ungrateful brat, she shouted, her face turning red with fury. How dare you threaten to call security on your own mother? 5 years ago, you dragged your suitcase out of our house crying like a pathetic loser. If it was not for the brilliant foster family genetics, you would be flipping burgers right now. You built this company using our blood, our resources, and our reputation. You are absolutely nothing without us. I kept my hand hovering near the phone, entirely unfazed by her dramatic tantrum. I am self-made, Patricia, I replied coldly, intentionally dropping the title of mother. You have zero claim to Aegis or my life. That is when Donovan stepped forward. He reached out and grabbed my wrist, pulling my hand away from the intercom console with a confident, predatory grin. Hold on there, Madeline, he said smoothly, adjusting his expensive tie with his free hand. Do not do anything rash, because legally speaking, we have every right to this company, and we have the exact paperwork to prove it. Donovan released my wrist and took a step back, adjusting his cuffs with an arrogant smirk. He reached into his designer leather briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper, sliding it across the glass table until it rested directly in front of me. It was a bank statement, an incredibly old and creased bank statement from exactly 5 years ago. My father Richard finally looked up from his shoes, crossing his arms over his chest, as if this single piece of paper gave him some kind of ultimate authority in my boardroom. Let me educate you on how venture capital works, Madeline Donovan said, his voice dripping with unbearable condescension. You see, when a tech company is founded, the initial seed money dictates the equity distribution. According to this highly official bank record dated exactly 5 years ago, you withdrew $10,000 from a joint family account. You used those exact funds to purchase the initial servers and cloud hosting space to get Aegis off the ground. My mother nodded enthusiastically, her eyes gleaming with raw greed. We funded you, she chimed in, taking a step closer to the table. We are your angel investors. Donovan paced slowly behind my chair, playing to the room of silent executives like a lawyer delivering a closing argument. In the eyes of the law, he continued that $10,000 was family property. You took family assets to build a commercial enterprise. Therefore, the resulting valuation of said enterprise belongs proportionately to the original investors. We are not just asking for 60% out of the goodness of our hearts. We are demanding what we are legally owed as the primary financial backers of this corporation. Sign the transfer agreement, or we will tie you up in litigation for the next decade. The two key investors sitting at my table exchanged a sudden worried glance. Seed capital disputes were serious business in the tech world. A messy lawsuit claiming stolen initial funding could completely derail our upcoming merger and send our billion-dollar valuation plummeting overnight. My mother saw the investors hesitate, and her smile grew even wider. She thought she had me trapped. She thought she had finally found the perfect leash to drag me back under her toxic control. I looked down at the faded bank statement. I looked at the date highlighted in bright yellow marker by Donovan. Then I looked up at the smug, expectant faces of my family members. I started to laugh. It was not a polite corporate chuckle. It was a loud, ringing, genuinely amused laugh that echoed sharply off the glass walls of the boardroom. My chief financial officer let out a long breath of relief, knowing me well enough to understand that my laughter meant the opposing side had just made a fatal, irreversible error. My mother face twisted in immediate outrage. "Stop laughing, you disrespectful child," she hissed, her hands balling into fists. "This is a serious legal demand." I stopped laughing, but the cold smile remained frozen on my face. I picked up the bank statement and held it up to the fluorescent light. "Donovan," I said, keeping my voice razor-sharp and perfectly steady. "You claim to be a hotshot Wall Street venture capitalist, but your due diligence is absolutely pathetic. Did you even bother to trace the origin of that $10,000 before you marched into my building to blackmail me?" Donovan frowned, his arrogant posture faltering for a split second. "It was a joint account with your mother name on it," he argued defensively. "That makes it communal family money." I dropped the paper back onto the table. "It was a joint account from when I was a teenager," I explained loudly, ensuring every executive and investor in the room heard the absolute truth. "And the only reason $10,000 was deposited into that account 5 years ago was because I got hit by a drunk driver running a red light. That money was my personal medical settlement. It was my pain and suffering compensation for a broken collarbone and 3 fractured ribs." My father looked away immediately, unable to meet my eyes, but Patricia stood her ground, glaring at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. I turned my attention directly to my mother, ignoring everyone else in the room. "Should we tell your precious son-in-law the rest of the story, Patricia?" I asked, stepping away from my chair. "Should we tell him what you tried to do the very morning that settlement check cleared the bank?" She opened her mouth to speak, but I did not give her the chance. "My mother went to the bank to freeze that account," I told the room, my voice echoing with icy precision. "She planned to seize my medical settlement to pay off $20,000 in credit card debt that my darling sister Caroline had racked up buying designer handbags and luxury vacations. My mother decided my broken bones were the perfect funding source for Caroline's shopping addiction. But I woke up early despite the heavy pain medication, limped to a different bank branch, and withdrew every single penny of my own settlement money 2 hours before she could lock me out of it." A collective gasp rippled through the boardroom. One of the investors actually shook his head in absolute disgust, staring directly at my parents. Donovan looked at Caroline, his jaw clenched, sensing that his waterproof legal threat was rapidly dissolving into a humiliating public spectacle. "That money was never yours," I stated firmly, slapping my hand flat against the glass table, causing my family to physically flinch. "It was the price of my own broken body. I used my own blood money to buy my first servers. You are not angel investors. You are vultures who tried to steal from a wounded daughter. You have absolutely zero legal, financial, or moral claim to a single line of code in this company." The air in the room grew suffocatingly tense. The power dynamic had instantly shifted back into my hands, and my family knew it. Donovan carefully stepped back, realizing his grand legal strategy was completely worthless and highly embarrassing. But Caroline could not handle the humiliation. Being exposed as a debt-ridden shopaholic in front of highly successful billionaires shattered her fragile ego entirely. Her face flushed a deep, angry red. She pushed past her husband, marching right up to my chair and jabbing a manicured finger directly in my face. "You are such a liar!" Caroline screamed, her voice shrill and echoing with sudden panic. "You always play the victim, Madeline. You think you are so perfect and innocent just because you have some money now. You want to talk about what happened 5 years ago. Let us talk about it. Let us talk about the real reason Mom and Dad threw your ungrateful self out onto the freezing streets." Caroline was breathing heavily, her eyes wild with sheer desperation. She was fully ready to dig up the darkest night of our lives just to avoid looking like the villain in front of a room full of strangers. Caroline slammed her hands on the glass table with such force that the coffee cups rattled. Her voice was shrill and desperate, echoing loudly across the executive suite. "You want to play the victim, Madeline? Fine. Tell your little corporate friends here why Mom and Dad actually kicked you out. Tell them how you betrayed your own flesh and blood when I needed you the most. Tell them how you ruined my life." I looked at my sister. The sheer audacity of her statement was almost breathtaking. She was actually trying to spin a felony into a story of sisterly betrayal. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the eyes of every investor and executive burning into the side of my face. "You mean the night you drove your sports car into a parked minivan while you were blackout drunk?" I asked loudly, ensuring my voice carried to every single corner of the room. "Is that the specific night you are referring to, Caroline?" My mother gasped loudly and took an aggressive step forward. "Keep your voice down, you vindictive wretch!" She hissed, her face contorting with rage. "This is private family business." "No," I said, standing up straight and facing my family directly. "You burst into my company uninvited. You demanded my life work. You want to air our dirty laundry in front of my investors and my executive board. Then let us air it all out right here and right now." I turned my attention to my board of directors. 5 years ago, my brilliant little sister went to a high society party. She drank entirely too much tequila. She got behind the wheel of her car and she crashed it into a family vehicle. Then she fled the scene of a crime like an absolute coward and came crying to our parents to fix her mess. Caroline's face was bright red with anger and humiliation. I was terrified. She screamed, defending herself. "I made a mistake. A mistake is dropping a glass, Caroline." I shot back, my voice sharp as broken glass. "Driving drunk and committing a hit and run is a felony. But Mom and Dad did not care about the law or the innocent people you could have easily killed. They only cared about your upcoming wedding. You were engaged to a billionaire shipping heir. A marriage that would have elevated the Foster family into the elite high society circles they always craved. A criminal record would have instantly ruined the extensive background check his wealthy family was running on you." My father, Richard, finally spoke up, his face pale and sweating. "We were trying to protect her future, Madeline. We were trying to protect the family name from public disgrace. By sacrificing mine, I demanded stepping closer to him. You woke me up at 2 in the morning. You dragged me into the living room, and you demanded that I go to the police station. You ordered me to confess that I was the one driving her car. You wanted me to take a felony charge on my permanent record. You wanted me to go to prison so your precious golden child could wear a pristine white dress and sip champagne at a luxury country club." Patricia glared at me with zero remorse. Her eyes were cold and calculating. "You were working a dead-end job. You had absolutely no prospects and no ambition. A minor mark on your record would not have mattered in the grand scheme of things. Caroline had a bright and glorious future ahead of her. She was marrying into old money. You were supposed to be her loyal sister. You were supposed to step up and take the fall for the greater good of this family." The collective shock in the boardroom was incredibly palpable. My chief financial officer stared at my mother as if she was an alien creature. The two key investors were completely silent, absorbing the horrifying reality of the people trying to claim ownership of my billion-dollar company. They were witnessing firsthand the pure toxicity I had escaped. Realizing that her aggressive shouting was not winning over the room, Caroline suddenly burst into loud theatrical tears. It was the exact same fake crying routine she had used since childhood, whenever she wanted to escape accountability. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing dramatically and leaning her weight against Donovan. "He left me because of you," Caroline wailed, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at me. "When the police figured out the truth, the scandal hit the local news. His wealthy family canceled the wedding immediately. I lost everything. I lost the massive estate. I lost the trust fund access. My perfect life was completely ruined, and it was all your fault. If you had just gone to the police and taken the blame like a good sister, I would be a billionaire wife right now instead of struggling. I refuse to ruin my entire life for your crime." I continued staring directly into Caroline, tear-stained face completely unmoved by her performance. "And because I refused to be your disposable scapegoat, Mom and Dad physically dragged me to the front door." It was the middle of December. There was heavy snow on the ground. You threw me out into the freezing night with nothing but the thin pajamas I was wearing. You did not even let me grab my winter coat or my shoes. I turned my heavy gaze to Patricia. "You looked me in the eyes and called me a piece of garbage. You said I was a useless waste of space and that I was dead to you forever. You locked the deadbolt and left me to freeze on the porch." Patricia lifted her chin proudly, refusing to back down or show even a shred of maternal guilt. "And I meant every single word I said that night. You are a traitor to this family, Madeline. And yet here you are." I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet whisper that cut through the tension. Standing in the lobby of the useless waste of space, demanding a massive handout. Caroline continued to sob loudly, burying her face in her hands. She realized entirely too late that she had miscalculated her attack. Her desperate attempt to paint me as the villain had only exposed the Foster family as a group of ruthless, manipulative criminals who would sacrifice their own blood for social status. The investors were looking at them with open, unconcealed disgust. Caroline had handed me the ultimate moral victory on a silver platter. Donovan saw the corporate room turning completely against them. He was a con artist, and he knew when an emotional angle was dead in the water. He realized that emotional manipulation and screaming matches were getting them nowhere and only making them look worse. He needed to regain control of the room and shift the focus back to hard leverage. He grabbed Caroline by the shoulders and pulled her back aggressively, silencing her fake tears with a sharp warning look. He stepped forward smoothly, adjusting his designer suit jacket and clearing his throat. The arrogant smirk returned to his face, replacing his brief moment of panic. He reached into his inner breast pocket, moving with deliberate slowness to draw everyone's attention. He did not pull out another fake bank statement or a family photo. Instead, Donovan pulled out a small, sleek silver USB drive. He held it up high between his thumb and forefinger, letting the bright boardroom lights catch its metallic surface, smiling like a predator who had just found the perfect weapon. Donovan tossed the silver USB drive. It hit the thick glass table with a sharp clack that echoed like a gunshot through the silent boardroom. He leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the glass, mirroring the aggressive stance my mother had taken moments earlier. His expensive cologne filled the space, mixing with the palpable tension. "Let me explain how the real world works, Madeline." He began, his voice dripping with smooth, calculated malice. "You are sitting on a gold mine. We all know Aegis is gearing up for a massive initial public offering next quarter. You are about to ring the bell and take this company public. You are expecting to pull in billions of dollars from institutional investors. But IPOs are incredibly fragile things. They rely entirely on trust, on a spotless corporate record, and on a CEO with an impeccable background." He tapped his polished fingernail against the silver drive. Inside this little device is a collection of highly sensitive financial records. They are foundational documents from the very first year Aegis existed. Now, you might remember your startup phase differently, but these specific files paint a very dark picture. They include detailed ledgers demonstrating massive tax evasion. They contain a series of internal emails proving that the core source code for your flagship cybersecurity software was actually stolen intellectual property. My chief financial officer stiffened in his chair, his face draining of color. He knew as well as I did that the code was entirely my own creation, built during those freezing nights in a rundown studio apartment. But he also knew the catastrophic damage a rumor could inflict. "They are completely fabricated," I said, my voice deadpan. "You doctored those files." Donovan offered a wide, predatory grin that showed all his teeth. "It absolutely does not matter if they are doctored," he replied smoothly. "In the high-stakes financial world, perception is reality. If I send the contents of this drive to the Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg tomorrow morning, your public offering is entirely dead on arrival. The Securities and Exchange Commission will immediately halt your IPO to launch a full-scale federal investigation into your early financial practices. Your corporate valuation will plummet into the dirt before lunchtime." He began pacing again, circling the table like a shark closing in on bleeding prey. "Investors despise volatility, Madeline. They run from scandal faster than a burning building, and there is no scandal more toxic than a brilliant young CEO being sued by her own loving parents and her sister for corporate fraud and theft. It is a public relations nightmare. The media will feast on you. They will brand you as a ruthless, greedy daughter who trampled over her own flesh and blood to get to the top. Your clients will panic and cancel their contracts. Your board will force you to resign in disgrace just to save the sinking ship." My father Richard stood silently behind him, nodding along to the threat as if this was just a standard business negotiation and not the outright extortion of his own child. Caroline had completely stopped her fake crying. She wiped her eyes and stood up straight, watching me with a vicious gleam of anticipation. "So here is your one and only option," Donovan concluded, stopping right across the table from me. "You pick up a pen and you sign the transfer agreement, giving the Foster Family Trust 60% of this company. In exchange, this little USB drive goes straight into the shredder. We keep our mouths shut. We play the role of the proud, supportive family, standing right by your side when you ring that bell on Wall Street. You get to keep 40% of a billion-dollar company, and your pristine reputation remains perfectly intact. If you refuse, I make one phone call, and I burn your entire empire to the ground." The silence that followed his ultimatum was absolute and suffocating. The air conditioning hummed quietly above us, the only sound in a room paralyzed by a billion-dollar ransom demand. The two key investors seated at my table looked deeply disturbed. They were men who dealt in calculated risks, and this family drama was an explosive variable they had not anticipated. Donovan had played his hand brilliantly, capitalizing on the exact fears that keep Wall Street executives awake at night. He knew that most CEOs, faced with the total annihilation of their life work, would instantly fold. They would surrender the equity just to make the nightmare go away. They would pay the ransom. My mother, Patricia, finally stepped forward, breaking the heavy silence. She walked right up to the edge of the table and crossed her arms over her chest. The panicked, defensive woman from 5 minutes ago was completely gone. In her place stood the arrogant, controlling matriarch I remembered from my childhood. She tilted her chin up, staring down her nose at me with a look of pure, triumphant satisfaction. She let out a soft, condescending sigh, as if she were a patient teacher dealing with a slow-learning student. "You always were too stubborn for your own good, Madeline," she said, her voice echoing with artificial sweetness. "But you have to admit when you are beaten. You played a good game, but you are outmatched. Donovan knows this industry inside and out. He knows exactly how to break you." She gestured lazily toward the legal documents still resting on the glass table. "Just sign the papers. It does not have to be ugly. We are willing to forgive your little outburst today. We are willing to welcome you back into the family fold. All you have to do is acknowledge that we are in charge. Acknowledge that you need us." The psychological weight of her words was designed to crush my spirit. For my entire life, she had conditioned me to believe that defiance only led to severe punishment. She was using every manipulative tactic in her arsenal, combining the threat of total financial ruin with the twisted promise of family acceptance. It was the exact same toxic dynamic that had driven me to near insanity during my youth. Caroline chimed in, her voice dripping with venomous delight. "Do not be stupid, Madeline. You have exactly 10 seconds to make the right choice before Donovan makes that phone call. You are holding up our entire day, and I have a flight to catch tonight." The two investors shifted nervously again, clearly weighing their options. If I signed, I was giving away the majority control of the company to a group of hostile, inexperienced extortionists. If I refused, the company would be dragged through a catastrophic public mudslinging campaign. Either way, the future of Aegis appeared to be in massive jeopardy. Patricia stood rigid, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. A smug, triumphant smile stretched across her face, altering her features into a mask of pure victory. Her eyes locked onto mine, unblinking and entirely devoid of any maternal warmth. She was relishing every single second of this standoff. She was waiting for my shoulders to slump. She was waiting for the tears of defeat to well up in my eyes. She was waiting for me to collapse into the chair and surrender my entire existence to her control. She waited for me to fall to my knees and beg for her forgiveness. The suffocating silence in the boardroom was suddenly broken by the sound of my father clearing his throat. Richard Foster had always been a man who preferred to hide in the background, letting my mother fight all the battles. He was a coward by nature, a man who avoided direct conflict whenever possible. But now, seeing that Donovan had laid down the ultimate threat and Patricia had delivered the psychological blow, my father decided it was the perfect time to play his favorite role. He was going to be the good cop. He stepped out from behind my mother and walked slowly toward the edge of the glass table. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and put on a mask of deep paternal concern. His eyes softened, and he let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, as if this entire hostile takeover was causing him immense personal pain. He looked at me with the exact same expression of fake pity he used 5 years ago when he watched me drag my suitcase through the freezing snow. "Madeline, sweetheart." He began, his voice thick with artificial warmth. "You have to understand that we are doing this because we love you. We are your family. We want what is best for your future." I stared at him completely silent, letting him dig his own grave with every single word. "You have done a genuinely nice job getting this little software project off the ground." He continued, gesturing vaguely around the billion-dollar executive suite, as if it were a lemonade stand. "But let us be entirely realistic here. Taking a tech company public is a massive undertaking. Dealing with Wall Street sharks, managing global supply chains, handling billions of dollars in investor capital, that is simply too much stress for a young woman to handle entirely on her own. The pressure is clearly getting to you." He smiled gently, pointing an open hand toward the grinning man in the custom suit standing nearby. "Donovan is a seasoned professional. He understands the financial sector inside and out. He knows how to navigate the complex corporate waters that you are currently drowning in. If you sign these transfer documents, Donovan will immediately step in and take over the role of Chief Executive Officer. He will handle the heavy lifting. He will manage the aggressive investors and the media relations. He has the proper background and the masculine authority required to lead a company of this magnitude into its next phase of global expansion." The sheer magnitude of his insult hung heavily in the crisp air of the boardroom. I could see my chief financial officer gripping his pen so tightly his knuckles had turned completely white. The two key investors at the table shifted uncomfortably, absolutely appalled by the blatant sexism and pure disrespect falling from my father's lips. Richard was standing in the very building I had designed. He was standing on the floor I had purchased with my own hard-earned capital. He was breathing the air conditioning paid for by the enterprise I built from absolutely nothing. Yet he looked me dead in the eyes and told me I was fundamentally incapable of leading my own empire. He honestly believed that a flashy con artist who married his favorite daughter was inherently more qualified to run a tech conglomerate simply because he wore a designer tie and spoke with loud, unearned confidence. "You will still retain 40% of the equity," my father reasoned, his tone incredibly soothing, as if he were explaining a simple math problem to a toddler. "You will never have to work another 16-hour day in your life, Madeline. You can step down quietly and live comfortably off the dividends. You can finally take a vacation. You can focus on finding a nice husband and starting a family of your own, instead of obsessing over computer screens all night. Donovan will ensure the company is highly profitable for all of us." My father leaned forward, resting his hands on the glass table directly across from me. His voice dropped to an intimate pleading register heavily laced with toxic emotional manipulation. "We want you back in our lives, Madeline. We really do. If you just sign the papers and let Donovan take the wheel, we can put all this ugly business behind us. We can forgive you for the mistakes you made in the past. We can all sit around the dinner table this Christmas and be a real family again. Just imagine it, sweetheart. A peaceful holiday without any of this stressful corporate burden weighing you down. Do the smart thing. Do the right thing for your family." My mother, Patricia, nodded in solemn agreement, her arms still crossed tightly over her chest. Caroline smiled brightly, clearly thrilled by the fantasy of her husband taking my office, taking my title, and stealing my entire life work. Donovan simply stood there, exuding absolute arrogance, thoroughly convinced that his extortion plot had worked flawlessly. They were a united front of pure, unadulterated greed, masquerading as a loving family, staging an intervention. They had planned this entire performance down to the very last detail. The aggressive entry, the legal threats, the fabricated evidence, and now the emotional rescue operation. They expected me to crumble under the combined weight of their intimidation and their fake affection. They expected the scared, lonely 28-year-old girl they had thrown out 5 years ago to suddenly reappear and beg for their toxic love. I kept my hands resting flat on the cool glass surface of the conference table. I looked at the fraudulent transfer agreement sitting inches from my fingers. I looked at the silver drive containing the fabricated financial documents Donovan planned to use to destroy me. Then I slowly lowered my head. I let my hair fall forward, completely hiding my face from their view. I allowed my shoulders to drop, losing the rigid, confident posture I had maintained since the moment they barged through the doors. My chest began to heave. My shoulders started to shake visibly under my tailored suit jacket. I let out a soft, muffled sound that echoed quietly in the tense, silent room. From across the table, I could hear the immediate shift in their demeanor. I heard Caroline let out a short, triumphant breath. I heard my mother high heels shift as she relaxed her aggressive stance. They looked at my trembling shoulders, and they saw exactly what they desperately wanted to see. They saw a broken, defeated woman weeping in total despair, realizing she had absolutely no way out. They thought I was crying. They thought I was completely crushed by the undeniable reality that they had beaten me at my own game. The sound of my shaking shoulders seemed to embolden them. Patricia let out a sharp, victorious exhale. She walked closer to the table, her expensive heels clicking a steady rhythm of absolute triumph. She looked down at my bowed head and let the mask of fake maternal concern drop, completely revealing the ugly, bitter truth underneath. "Oh, stop the dramatic weeping, Madeline." Patricia sneered, her voice dripping with sheer disgust. "It is honestly pathetic. You are 33 years old and look at you. You are completely alone. No husband to support you. No children to carry on a legacy. No real life outside of this sterile glass building. You have spent the last 5 years staring at computer screens until your brain essentially rotted away. You hide behind these corporate walls because you are terrified of the real world. You are mentally unstable, and everyone in this room can clearly see it." Patricia leaned over, placing her manicured hands near the fraudulent contract. "We are actually doing you a massive favor by stepping in to take control. You are cracking under the pressure of playing a corporate boss. Women like you who reject their natural family duties always end up having a severe nervous breakdown. You need to be removed from this stressful environment before you end up in a psychiatric ward." Caroline could not resist the perfect opportunity to join the feeding frenzy. She stepped right beside our mother, her face glowing with a malicious kind of joy. She lifted her left hand intentionally, catching the bright fluorescent boardroom lights on her massive diamond engagement ring. She twisted her fingers, making the expensive jewels sparkle right in my line of sight, a silent taunt meant to remind me of her supposed superiority. "Mom is absolutely right," Caroline chimed in, her voice echoing with bratty arrogance. "Just look at my beautiful life compared to your miserable existence. Donovan treats me like an absolute queen. He buys me expensive diamonds, he takes me on luxury vacations to Europe, and he provides for me like a real man should. What do you have, Madeline? A lonely, empty apartment and a bunch of boring computer code. You are turning into a bitter old spinster, and it is painful to watch." Caroline crossed her arms, puffing out her chest proudly. "Donovan says your company is probably a disorganized mess anyway. You should be thanking us on your knees for intervening. By taking 60% of this highly stressful company, we are giving you the ultimate gift of freedom. We are clearing your schedule so you can finally go to a salon, buy some decent clothes, and find a man who can tolerate your terrible personality. Who knows if Donovan fixes this broken company up? Maybe one of his wealthy Wall Street friends will take pity on you and ask you out on a blind date." I listened to their toxic symphony, committing every cruel word to memory. This was the absolute validation I needed. Any lingering microscopic shred of familial guilt I might have felt about completely destroying them evaporated into the cold air. My chief financial officer shifted in his seat, his face a mask of pure revulsion. The two billionaire investors who had been sitting quietly through this entire ordeal looked absolutely sickened by the verbal abuse raining down on me. They were witnessing a masterclass in severe family toxicity. My mother and sister were not just trying to steal $1 billion tech firm. They were actively trying to crush my spirit, humiliate me in front of my elite peers, and reduce my entire professional existence to my marital status. Donovan chuckled softly from the background, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle. He adjusted his expensive watch, fully believing that his brilliant extortion plot had successfully broken the stubborn CEO. "Listen to your mother and sister, Madeline," he said smoothly. "They know exactly what is best for you. Just sign the transfer papers and you can go cry in your luxury penthouse while the adults handle the real corporate business." They stood there waiting for my absolute surrender. They expected my tears to hit the glass table. They expected me to reach out with a trembling hand and pick up the pen to sign away my life work. They had pushed every single psychological button they used to abuse me with during my childhood. But I was not a helpless child anymore. I took one final deep breath, letting my shoulders rise and fall. Then the shaking stopped entirely. The muffled sounds echoing from my bowed head completely shifted in tone. It was no longer a quiet sound of defeat. It grew louder, more rhythmic, and undeniably clear. I was laughing. I lifted my head and leaned back into my ergonomic leather executive chair. My face was completely dry. My makeup was absolutely flawless. There was not a single tear in my eyes. Instead, my gaze was blazing with a cold, calculating fire that made Patricia physically take a quick step backward in sudden confusion. The smug, triumphant smiles on the faces of my mother and sister instantly vanished. Caroline dropped her hand, hiding her diamond ring, as a wave of deep uncertainty washed over her. Donovan frowned, his confident posture stiffening as he realized the psychological warfare had completely failed to break my resolve. "You actually think I am crying over your pathetic high school insults?" I asked, my voice echoing with pure, unfiltered amusement. "You march into my building, threaten me with federal fraud, insult my physical appearance, and tell me I need a man to save me from my own success. You are all so incredibly predictable, it is almost boring." I did not bother addressing their absurd comments about my personal life. I did not need to justify my 33 years of existence, my lack of a husband, or my thriving independence to people who lived off credit card debt and endless lies. "I gave you exactly 5 minutes to state your demands and show your hand," I declared, sitting up straight and folding my hands neatly on top of their fraudulent contract. "And you played every single card you had perfectly. The fake bank statement, the empty threats about the media, the fabricated USB drive. You laid out a textbook case of corporate extortion right in front of multiple key witnesses." I turned my head slightly toward the heavy double doors of the boardroom. I did not need to press the intercom on the console. I simply raised my right hand and snapped my fingers once. The heavy glass doors swung open immediately. Walking into the room with the predatory grace of a seasoned courtroom killer was my personal corporate attorney, Vivian Ross. She wore a razor-sharp black suit, carrying a thick leather briefcase, and an expression of absolute legal lethality. Vivian did not tolerate fools, and she certainly did not tolerate arrogant extortionists interrupting her high-profile clients. Vivian Ross walked with the measured, lethal grace of a predator who had just entered a cage full of very oblivious prey. She did not introduce herself to my parents. She did not offer a polite handshake to my sister or her fraudulent husband. Vivian simply walked straight to my side of the glass table, her sharp heels cutting through the heavy silence of the boardroom. She reached out with a perfectly manicured hand and picked up the thick stack of transfer documents that my mother had violently slapped down earlier. The Foster family watched her with expressions of overwhelming smugness. They completely misinterpreted Vivian arriving as a sign of my ultimate surrender. In their greedy, delusional minds, a lawyer only showed up at the last minute to review the terms of defeat and ensure the surrender was legally binding. Donovan was the first to fully embrace the illusion of victory. He let out a loud, arrogant breath and unbuttoned his custom suit jacket. Moving with the exaggerated swagger of a man who believed he had just conquered $1 billion empire, he claimed one of the plush leather executive chairs meant for my board members. He sank into the luxurious leather, crossed his legs at the knee, and draped his arms over the armrests. He looked around the pristine boardroom with a hungry, evaluating gaze, as if he were already measuring the square footage for his own personal use. He turned his attention to my chief financial officer, who was still sitting frozen in shock. "Hey, you!" Donovan barked, snapping his fingers loudly in the air. "Yes, you in the cheap suit. Since my sister-in-law is about to be relieved of her stressful duties, I am stepping in as your new chief executive officer effective immediately. You can start making yourself useful by heading down to the lobby and getting me a double espresso. No sugar, 2 pumps of vanilla. And make it quick. I have a lot of restructuring to do today." My chief financial officer stared at him, his jaw physically dropping at the sheer audacity. He was a highly respected finance veteran who managed hundreds of millions of dollars daily, and this flashy con artist was treating him like an unpaid intern. But Donovan was not finished. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the glass table, completely ignoring the furious glares from my 2 billionaire investors. "Actually, do not bother bringing the coffee back for yourself," Donovan continued, waving his hand dismissively. "Because the very first thing I am doing after Madeline signs that paper is firing this entire management team. You are all severely underqualified. You lack the proper Wall Street pedigree and the elite status required to run a global conglomerate. I will be bringing in my own guys. Real players from the financial district who actually know how to generate aggressive revenue." Caroline clapped her hands together, letting out a high-pitched squeal of delight. "Oh, honey, that is a brilliant idea," she chirped, stepping up behind his chair and resting her hands on his shoulders. "This whole building needs a massive upgrade. The decor is so boring and clinical." Donovan nodded in enthusiastic agreement. "Exactly. In fact, tomorrow morning I am having the contractors come in. We are going to knock down the walls of the 3 adjacent executive suites. I need a proper corner office, something massive with a private wet bar and a dedicated elevator. The current CEO office is entirely too small for a man of my caliber. We need to completely rebrand this place to reflect the new premium leadership." Patricia smiled proudly, watching her son-in-law dismantle my life work piece by piece. She looked around the room as if sizing up which company assets she would liquidate first. Richard simply stood by the door, looking incredibly relieved that the messy confrontation was supposedly over and the money was finally secured. They were practically picking out the colors for their new company, leased luxury vehicles, while Vivian continued to silently flip through the pages of their ridiculous contract. The sound of thick paper turning was the only noise competing with Donovan's relentless bragging. Vivian read quickly, her highly trained eyes scanning the legal jargon with forensic precision. I watched a small, sharp smile tug at the corner of her lips. It was the smile she always got right before she annihilated an opposing legal team in federal court. Vivian tapped the documents against the glass table, aligning the edges perfectly. Then she looked directly at Donovan. "This document is a fascinating piece of amateur fiction, Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice ringing with absolute authority and icy professionalism. "I have reviewed hostile takeover contracts for major corporations, but I have never seen a legal draft quite as blatantly exploitative and fundamentally absurd as this one." Donovan scoffed, his arrogant posture faltering slightly. "It is a standard equity transfer agreement drawn up by top-tier professionals. You are just trying to stall." Vivian ignored his interruption, turning her attention to the entire room. "Let me highlight a few of my favorite clauses for the board," she announced loudly. According to Section 4, Paragraph B, Madeline would not only surrender 60% of her equity, but she would instantly forfeit all voting rights and board seats. Section 7 demands the immediate transfer of all proprietary source code and intellectual property directly into the personal possession of Donovan Hayes. My investors let out a collective scoff of pure disgust. It was a corporate death sentence, but the absolute best part is Section 12. Vivian continued flipping to the final page. It states that the new chief executive officer assumes zero personal or financial liability for any existing corporate debts, while simultaneously granting him unrestricted, unsupervised access to all operating capital. This is not a business transfer. This is a licensed robbery. They are asking you to hand over the keys to the vault while legally binding your hands behind your back. Vivian turned to me, her expression turning serious and fiercely protective. Madeline, as your legal counsel, I strongly advise you to throw this fraudulent trash into the nearest incinerator. Signing this document would be corporate suicide. They are trying to strip you of every single asset you have ever built, while leaving you completely powerless to stop them from draining the company dry. The room held its breath. The executives, the investors, Vivian and my entire toxic family all locked their eyes on me. Patricia glared, her face red with sudden anger at Vivian interference. Donovan gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles turning white, ready to launch back into his aggressive extortion threats about the flash drive. I looked at the documents resting on the table. I looked at the furious, desperate faces of my parents and my sister. I looked at the flashy, arrogant man who thought he had outsmarted a woman who built a billion-dollar fortress from nothing. I raised my right hand, signaling Vivian to stop speaking. The room fell so incredibly silent you could hear a pin drop. Vivian. I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any fear. Please hand me your pen. Vivian hesitated for only a fraction of a second. She knew me well enough to understand that I never surrendered to anyone under any circumstances. She reached into the inside pocket of her tailored blazer and unclipped her heavy, gold-plated fountain pen. It was a custom piece she only used for finalizing massive corporate acquisitions. She handed it to me without a single word. The metal was cool against my skin. I rolled the expensive pen between my fingers, feeling its substantial weight and perfect balance. The entire boardroom seemed to hold its collective breath. The two billionaire investors gripped the padded edges of their leather seats, their faces pale with impending corporate disaster. My chief financial officer closed his eyes tightly, entirely unable to watch the destruction of everything we had built together over the last half-decade. Across the transparent glass table, my family was practically vibrating with toxic euphoria. My mother, Patricia, let out a breathless sound of absolute victory. This was the exact moment she had been desperately waiting for. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out her smartphone. Her manicured fingers tapped the screen, eagerly opening the camera application. She held the phone up high, aiming the lens directly at my face. She wanted a digital trophy to keep forever. She wanted high-definition video proof of her rebellious, successful daughter, finally bowing her head and submitting to the ultimate authority of the Foster family. She wanted to capture the exact second my spirit broke, so she could replay it for her wealthy socialite friends whenever she needed a boost to her fragile ego. Go ahead and sign it, Madeline. Patricia sneered from behind her glowing phone screen, her voice dripping with venomous joy. Make sure you press hard so the ink goes through to the bottom copies. This is going to be a monumental day for our family history. You are finally doing the right thing. Caroline leaned over her husband's shoulder, her eyes wide and hungry, tracking my every movement. She was already mentally spending the billions of dollars she thought they had just extorted from me. She was probably planning which luxury yachts and penthouse suites she would purchase by tomorrow morning. My father, Richard, let out a long, pathetic sigh of relief, wiping a bead of nervous sweat from his forehead. He truly believed the ugly confrontation was over and his comfortable retirement was permanently secured without him having to lift a finger. And then there was Donovan. He sat in my plush executive chair, his legs crossed, his expensive suit jacket open, grinning like a predator who had just swallowed his prey whole. He gave me a slow, mocking nod. Good girl, he murmured softly, his voice laced with pure condescension. You are finally learning how to play ball with the big dogs. Pick up the pen and hand over the keys to the kingdom. I lowered my gaze to the thick stack of fraudulent legal documents resting on the pristine glass surface. The bright fluorescent lights glared off the bright yellow sticky note pointing directly to the signature line. It was right there. The final step in their grand extortion plot. The silence in the 40-story high boardroom became absolute and entirely suffocating. You could hear the faint mechanical hum of the climate control system and the sharp clicking of my mother's long fingernails against the back of her smartphone casing. I let the heavy gold nib of the fountain pen hover exactly 1 inch above the crisp white paper. I took a slow, deliberate breath. In that single suspended second, every agonizing memory from the past 5 years flashed through my mind in vivid detail. I remembered the freezing winter snow seeping through my thin socks when they locked me out of my childhood home. I remembered the gnawing hunger in my empty stomach when I lived on cheap instant noodles in a roach-infested studio apartment. I remembered the thousands of grueling hours staring at glowing computer screens, typing line after line of complex security code until my fingers bled and my vision blurred. I had built Aegis from the ashes of their devastating betrayal. Every single line of code, every patent, every server, every corporate contract was a testament to my survival against all odds. And these pathetic, arrogant parasites honestly thought they could simply walk in and take it all away with a fake bank statement and a cheap blackmail threat. I pressed the sharp metal nib of the pen down onto the signature line. Patricia leaned in closer, her phone recording every single frame. Caroline held her breath in pure anticipation. Donovan's smirk widened into a full-blown wicked grin of total triumph. I did not write my name. I did not form a single looping letter of my signature. Instead, I gripped the heavy gold pen with white-knuckled force, and I drove the sharp metal tip violently into the paper. I dragged my hand upward in a brutal, aggressive diagonal slash, pressing down with so much physical force that the sharp nib sliced cleanly through the thick legal paper. The harsh tearing sound of the contract ripping apart echoed loudly like a scream in the silent room. I did not stop there. I reversed my grip and slashed downward, creating a massive, chaotic, and violently destructive cross right over their fraudulent signature line. I pressed so deeply that the nib scratched harshly against the reinforced glass table underneath, leaving a permanent visible scar on the pristine surface. The abrupt tearing sound completely shattered the illusion of their victory. Before anyone could even process the violent destruction of their legal documents, I snapped my wrist upward. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I did not shout a warning. I threw the heavy gold-plated fountain pen straight across the long conference table with the speed and precision of a professional fastball. The heavy metal pen flew through the air and slammed directly into Donovan's face. It struck him incredibly hard right on the bridge of his nose. He let out a loud, shocked yelp of physical pain, throwing his hands up to cover his face, as the pen clattered onto the glass table and rolled away, leaving a smear of dark blue ink. The entire room erupted into absolute chaos. My chief financial officer gasped, jumping back in his seat, as if a bomb had just gone off. The two billionaire investors stared at me in absolute stunned disbelief, their mouths slightly open. Patricia shrieked in genuine horror, fumbling her smartphone and nearly dropping it onto the floor. Her perfect video recording of my supposed defeat was completely ruined. Caroline screamed loudly, lunging forward to check on her husband, who was now cursing violently and rubbing the angry red welt forming rapidly on his nose. Richard stumbled backward, hitting the drywall, looking absolutely terrified of the sudden explosion of violence. I stood up slowly from my executive chair, towering over the ruined, torn contract. I reached up and smoothly adjusted the lapels of my tailored blazer. I looked at the panicked, scrambling mess of the Foster family, and a slow, cold half-smile finally broke across my face. "You really thought I was going to hand you my empire?" I asked, my voice cutting through their chaotic shouting like a sharpened blade of ice. "You really thought you could walk into my fortress and dictate terms to me?" I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and pulled out a sleek black remote control. I did not break eye contact with Donovan, who was glaring at me with pure, murderous rage, his hand still covering his bruised nose. I raised the remote, pointing it directly toward the massive blank wall behind my executive chair. I pressed a single button with my thumb. With a deep, resonating electronic hum, the giant LED screen covering the entire back wall of the boardroom powered to life, illuminating the space with a blinding bright light. The time for playing their games was officially over. My counterattack had just begun. The massive LED screen covering the entire back wall of the boardroom surged to life with a deep, resonant mechanical hum. The sudden explosion of stark white light forced my mother to squint and raise her hand to shield her eyes. The high-definition display illuminated the entire executive suite, casting sharp shadows across the terrified faces of my family members. On the screen, a live broadcast from the premier global financial news network began playing at a low but commanding volume. A prominent news anchor sat at a sleek glass desk, a bright red breaking news banner flashing urgently across the bottom third of the screen. Donovan lowered his hands from his bleeding nose, his arrogant facade completely shattering as his eyes locked onto the glowing display. He blinked rapidly, trying to process the bold, scrolling text. "You walked into my building today completely convinced that you held the ultimate leverage," I said, my voice projecting across the room with lethal authority. "You spent all that time fabricating a cheap silver USB drive, believing you could hold my upcoming initial public offering hostage. You thought you could terrify me with the threat of volatile markets and nervous Wall Street investors. You honestly believed I was just some naive little girl playing dress-up in the corporate world, desperately terrified of a public relations scandal." I stepped away from my chair, moving slowly around the ruined glass table. My tailored blazer caught the bright light of the screen as I approached the center of the room, forcing my family to shrink back. "But here is the massive fatal flaw in your brilliant extortion plot, Donovan," I continued, keeping my gaze locked directly on his rapidly paling face. "You based your entire blackmail strategy on outdated industry rumors. You based your attack on the assumption that Aegis was going public next quarter." I raised my hand and gestured elegantly toward the massive screen behind me. The news anchor voice filled the room, delivering the exact financial update my family had completely missed while they were busy plotting their pathetic corporate heist. "You want to extort a company about to IPO?" I asked, a sharp, mocking smile spreading across my face. "I am so incredibly sorry to disappoint you, Donovan. Aegis is not doing an IPO. We are not ringing any bells on Wall Street. We are not courting any fragile public investors or worrying about stock market volatility." The red breaking news banner on the screen shifted, displaying a massive headline in bold white letters. It read, "United States Department of Defense acquires 80% majority stake in cybersecurity firm Aegis." Last Friday afternoon, behind heavily guarded closed doors in Washington, I signed a highly classified acquisition contract. I declared, my voice ringing with absolute, undeniable triumph. I sold exactly 80% of my equity directly to the United States government. Aegis is no longer a private civilian tech startup. We are now a top-tier federal security contractor. My software currently protects the most highly classified military supply chains and intelligence databases in the entire country. The silence that violently crashed down upon the boardroom was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was the sound of absolute, total psychological annihilation. My mother, Patricia, dropped her expensive smartphone. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp crack, the screen spider webbing into dozens of jagged pieces. She did not even flinch. She just stared at the massive LED screen, her jaw hanging completely slack, her eyes wide with a mixture of sheer terror and broken comprehension. All her greedy delusions of becoming a billionaire mother living in luxury penthouses evaporated into thin air. Caroline let out a soft, strangled gasp, stepping backward until her spine hit the drywall. She looked from the glowing news broadcast to my face, her arrogant superiority replaced by pure, unadulterated panic. She finally realized that she was not standing in the office of her weak older sister. She was standing in the heavily fortified headquarters of a major defense contractor. My father Richard looked physically sick. He grabbed the back of a leather chair for support, his chest heaving as he struggled to process the astronomical scale of their mistake. He had begged me to hand over the company to his flashy son-in-law, completely unaware that the company was already integrated into the national security grid. But Donovan's reaction was the most satisfying of all. The smooth-talking aggressive con artist from Wall Street was completely paralyzed. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his dark skin looking ashen and severely sickly. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He stared at the silver USB drive resting on the glass table, and I watched the horrifying realization slowly wash over him. He finally understood exactly what he had just done. I took another step closer to Donovan, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet pitch that commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the room. "Do you understand the gravity of the situation you have placed yourself in?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "You bypassed 3 levels of restricted corporate security to illegally enter this facility. You presented fraudulent financial documents. You attempted to force the chief executive officer of a federal defense asset to sign over majority control of a classified organization to an unauthorized civilian. And you did it all while holding a fabricated data drive as a weapon of blackmail." I pointed a single steady finger directly at his chest. "10 minutes ago you thought you were executing a clever family shakedown," I stated clearly, ensuring my words echoed flawlessly across the room. "But as of last Friday, this building operates under strict federal jurisdiction. Your little stunt today did not just violate corporate law. Your aggressive actions storming into my headquarters and explicitly threatening me with a fake USB drive have officially constituted the federal crime of extortion and threatening federal cybersecurity." The room started to spin for my family. The 2 billionaire investors who had remained seated at the table finally allowed themselves to smile. They were the minority shareholders who had happily retained their 20% stake during the government buyout. They knew exactly how much power I currently wielded, and they were thoroughly enjoying watching my toxic family walk blindly into a federal trap. "You did not just try to rob your daughter Patricia," I said, turning my cold gaze back to my mother. "You attempted to extort the United States government. And unlike me, the federal authorities do not possess a single ounce of familial mercy." Patricia took a sudden, unsteady step backward, her expensive designer heels catching slightly on the edge of the plush boardroom rug. The sheer weight of the words "federal extortion" hit her like a physical blow to the chest. All of her arrogant bluster, all of her cruel maternal superiority completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but raw, visceral panic. Richard immediately reached out and grabbed her arm, pulling her further away from the glass table. My father looked absolutely terrified, his face slick with nervous perspiration. He was a cowardly man who had spent his entire life avoiding severe consequences, and the sudden realization that he had just accidentally threatened a top-tier military contractor sent him into a state of visible shock. They were both shrinking against the drywall, desperately trying to distance themselves from the catastrophic legal nightmare unfolding in the center of the room. But Donovan was entirely too arrogant and far too deeply committed to his own elaborate con to simply surrender. He refused to accept that the naive sister-in-law he planned to easily manipulate had completely outmaneuvered him. He pulled a silk handkerchief from his breast pocket and aggressively wiped a smear of blood from his bruised nose. He let out a harsh, breathless laugh, shaking his head in an exaggerated display of manufactured disbelief. He pointed a trembling finger directly at the massive glowing LED screen. "You expect us to believe this ridiculous theatrical garbage?" Donovan sneered, his voice cracking slightly as he fought to maintain his aggressive Wall Street persona. "This is nothing but a cheap parlor trick, Madeline. You probably paid some freelance graphic designer to mock up a fake news broadcast just to scare us out of our legal rights. I work in the highest levels of finance. I monitor the global markets every single day. An 80% acquisition by the Department of Defense would trigger massive regulatory filings. It would be entirely impossible to keep that kind of monumental transaction hidden from the public sector. You are desperately bluffing because you know we have you completely cornered. You are trying to intimidate us with fake federal threats, but I am not backing down. I did not raise my voice to argue with his pathetic delusions. I simply lowered my remote control and began to walk. I stepped away from the head of the conference table, moving slowly and deliberately around the ruined, shattered transfer documents. My heels clicked a slow, lethal rhythm against the polished hardwood floor. Vivian, my corporate attorney, stepped back smoothly, allowing me a clear, unobstructed path toward the sweating, desperate man in the custom suit. The two billionaire investors leaned back in their heavy leather chairs, crossing their arms and watching the confrontation with intense, silent fascination. They knew exactly what kind of digital firepower I possessed, and they were thoroughly enjoying watching Donovan dig his own grave deeper with every single word he spoke. I stopped walking only when I was standing mere inches from Donovan. I invaded his personal space, forcing him to look down into my cold, unwavering eyes. He tried to puff out his chest and maintain his dominant posture, but his rapid, shallow breathing betrayed his mounting internal terror. Caroline watched from a few feet away, her hands clutching her expensive purse, her eyes darting nervously between her husband and my face. She was completely silent, unable to comprehend why the brilliant, wealthy man she married was suddenly sweating under my gaze. You walked into my corporate headquarters and loudly declared yourself to be a seasoned financial professional, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet pitch that commanded absolute silence in the massive room. You bragged about your elite status. You insulted my executive team. You demanded the corner office, and you promised my parents you would elevate their wealth to unimaginable new heights. I tilted my head slightly, studying the nervous sweat beading on his forehead. You say you are a Wall Street investment expert, Donovan. You say you manage my parents' retirement money. You promised Caroline a life of endless luxury. So let us take a very close look at your highly impressive portfolio. Let us see who you really are. I raised the sleek black remote control and pressed a different button. Instantly, the live news broadcast of the military acquisition vanished from the massive LED screen behind me. The bright white light was immediately replaced by a deep, stark black background. A split second later, the screen exploded into a chaotic, dizzying web of highly complex financial data. Intricate encrypted cash flow charts began to populate rapidly across the digital display. Bright red and green lines, jagged and erratic, intersected with lists of offshore routing numbers, shell company registrations, and hidden domestic accounts. Massive blocks of raw financial code scrolled aggressively down the sides of the screen, translating deeply buried digital transactions into stark, undeniable numbers. The boardroom was bathed in the harsh red glow of the financial tracking software. You see, Donovan, when you proudly swiped your driver license at my security desk in the lobby. You handed my network your entire legal identity, I explained, keeping my eyes locked on his horrified face. You assumed Aegis was just a simple software company. You forgot that my engineering team specializes in hunting down the most elusive cybercriminals on the entire planet. Tracking the digital footprint of a loud, flashy, low-level con artist was not even a challenge for my junior analysts. It was a 5-minute training exercise. The encrypted data on the glowing screen began to finalize its rapid decryption process, locking into clear, readable charts. My cybersecurity team had completely swept every single corner of Donovan's hidden financial existence. They had bypassed his pathetic digital firewalls, drained his encrypted transaction histories, and pulled every buried bank record he thought he had perfectly hidden from the world. The absolute truth of his fraudulent, flashy lifestyle was rendering in high definition right behind me. I was fully prepared to strip away his arrogant disguise and expose the horrifying true face of the precious golden son-in-law to the exact people he had so ruthlessly scammed. The giant screen behind me shifted from chaotic digital code into crystal clear banking statements and official legal filings. I kept my eyes locked on Donovan, watching his confident posture collapse into absolute rigid panic. You introduced yourself to my executives as a heavyweight venture capitalist managing a massive portfolio of elite clients, I said, my voice echoing sharply off the glass walls. But the federal databases my security team accessed tell a vastly different story. You do not hold a single valid license to trade securities. You do not have a corner office in the financial district. You are nothing but a smooth-talking criminal running a massive and incredibly sloppy Ponzi scheme. You took money from new investors to pay fake dividends to older investors, creating the grand illusion of massive wealth. But you never actually invested a single cent of their capital into legitimate Wall Street markets. You just shuffled stolen cash around to fund your custom-tailored suits, your luxury cars, and the massive diamond ring currently sitting on my sister hand. I pressed the button on my sleek remote control, and the massive screen zoomed in on two specific banking profiles. The names Richard Foster and Patricia Foster appeared in bold red letters at the very top of the bright display. My father let out a sharp, audible gasp, stumbling forward a few unsteady steps as he recognized his own personal account numbers flashing before his eyes. He stared at the screen in pure horror as the balance column rapidly descended from a healthy seven-figure number down to absolutely zero. Did you honestly believe Donovan was generating a 20% annual return on your retirement fund? Richard, I asked, turning my cold gaze to my horrified father. Did you never once question why his investment reports always looked like generic spreadsheets printed at a local copy shop? You eagerly handed this complete fraudster every single dollar you spent 40 years saving for your comfortable retirement. I clicked the remote again, and a property deed appeared next to the empty bank accounts. And Patricia. I continued watching my mother face turn a sickening shade of ashen gray. You always loved bragging to your socialite friends about that sprawling suburban mansion of yours. But according to these highly official bank records, your beloved son-in-law convinced you to take out a massive second mortgage on that property exactly 6 months ago. He promised you a guaranteed massive return on a commercial real estate development project that never actually existed. He drained your home equity completely dry and left you holding a worthless piece of paper. Caroline shook her head violently, stepping away from her husband as if he had suddenly caught a highly contagious and lethal disease. That is a complete lie, she shouted, her voice trembling with rising frantic hysteria. Donovan is incredibly successful. We travel all the time. We go to Las Vegas every single weekend for his high-level client meetings. I let out a harsh, humorless laugh that easily cut through her delusional, frantic defense. He was not meeting wealthy corporate clients in Las Vegas, Caroline. He was sitting at high-stakes VIP tables, desperately trying to gamble his way out of a rapidly collapsing pyramid scheme. The giant screen flashed a continuous series of heavy wire transfers routed directly to known offshore gambling syndicates and dangerous underground betting rings. Your brilliant, wealthy husband took your parents' entire life savings and pushed every last dime onto the roulette table, hoping for a miracle. He blew through millions of dollars of stolen capital, I stated, walking closer to the sweating, trembling man who was now completely trapped. And when the stolen family money finally ran out, he started borrowing heavily from incredibly dangerous people. The kind of ruthless people who do not take individuals to civil court when they fail to pay their debts. The kind of violent people who send armed enforcers to collect what they are owed. According to the encrypted underground ledgers my team successfully decrypted today, Donovan currently owes the criminal underworld exactly $15 million. The brutal interest is compounding daily, and his violent creditors have officially run out of patience. Donovan looked like he was about to physically vomit right onto my boardroom floor. His expensive designer suit was now clinging to his sweating, shaking body, and his hands trembled violently at his sides. The arrogant facade of the powerful corporate raider was entirely dead, leaving behind only a terrified, desperate criminal backed into a lethal, inescapable corner. This brings us to the actual reason you all staged this pathetic little family intervention today, I announced, projecting my voice, so every person in the room understood the sheer depravity of their actions. Donovan did not bring you here because he wanted to graciously take over my stressful duties as chief executive officer. He did not care about elevating the foster family wealth to new heights. He brought you here because the Securities and Exchange Commission has already caught wind of his massive financial anomalies. The federal authorities are quietly preparing to freeze all his hidden assets and issue a federal warrant for his immediate arrest. He is completely out of time, and he is out of gullible victims. I continued, pointing directly at the fraudulent contract still resting on the glass table. He manipulated my greedy parents and my jealous sister into doing his incredibly dirty work. He desperately needed you to force me into signing over 60% of this company today. His ultimate master plan was to immediately liquidate my corporate assets, drain my operational capital, and use my billion-dollar defense company as a personal piggy bank to pay off his $15 million underworld debt before the federal agents kicked down his front door. I turned to look at Patricia and Richard, who were now clinging to each other in absolute silent terror. They had marched into my office expecting to conquer my empire and walk away as elite billionaires. Instead, they were forced to watch their entire reality violently shatter into a million jagged pieces. You gladly let a cheap con artist convince you to attack your own daughter, I told my parents, my voice void of any human sympathy. You thought you were walking in here to steal my hard-earned wealth and secure your elite social status forever. But the undeniable, devastating truth is that you are already completely bankrupt. Your entire retirement fund is entirely gone. Your precious suburban mansion is leveraged to the absolute maximum. You are completely destitute, and you did not even realize it until this very second because you were entirely too busy worshiping the very man who robbed you blind. The sheer magnitude of my revelation struck my parents like a physical blow. Patricia and Richard slowly turned away from the glowing screen and locked their terrified eyes onto Donovan. The polished and charismatic son-in-law they had worshipped for years suddenly looked like a cornered animal. Richard took a shaky step toward him, his fists clenching tightly at his sides. My father had spent his entire life avoiding conflict, but the sudden realization that his retirement was completely gone finally pushed him over the absolute edge. He demanded an explanation, his voice trembling with a mixture of raw fear and rising anger. He asked Donovan where the money went, demanding to know if the offshore accounts flashing on the massive display were real. He grabbed the lapels of Donovan's custom suit, shaking the man who had promised them an empire of endless wealth. Donovan aggressively shoved my father's hands away, stepping backward until his expensive leather shoes hit the baseboard of the boardroom wall. He raised both hands in a defensive gesture, desperately trying to salvage his shattered facade. He stammered out a pathetic string of complex financial jargon, claiming that the global markets were simply experiencing a temporary liquidity crisis. He insisted that the funds were safely tied up in aggressive commercial real estate portfolios, and that the offshore routing numbers were merely standard tax optimization strategies used by all top-tier executives. He pleaded with my parents to trust him, swearing that the massive returns he promised were just around the corner, and that I was intentionally manipulating the data to confuse them. Patricia shook her head violently, her perfectly styled hair falling completely out of place. She refused to accept that her elite social standing was a complete illusion. She pointed a trembling finger at the screen and shouted that I was lying to ruin her life. She screamed that her magnificent suburban mansion was perfectly safe, and that she had just hosted a lavish charity dinner in her grand dining room the previous weekend. She clung to her fabricated reality with terrifying desperation, unwilling to admit that she had been utterly conned by the smooth-talking criminal she chose over her own daughter. I did not raise my voice to argue with her pathetic denial. I simply raised the remote control and pressed the button one more time. The massive screen shifted instantly, dropping the complex financial codes and displaying a single high-resolution legal document. It was an official bank foreclosure notice stamped with a bright red legal seal. The date on the document was clearly marked, showing it had been finalized and executed exactly 4 weeks ago. I read the severe eviction terms out loud, making sure every single syllable echoed flawlessly across the silent boardroom. I explained exactly how Donovan had managed to keep them entirely in the dark for so long. I detailed how my cybersecurity team discovered that Donovan had formally redirected all of their critical banking correspondence to a private post office box under a fake shell company name. He had systematically intercepted every single warning letter, every past due notice, and every desperate phone call from the mortgage lenders. He let them live in a house that already belonged to the bank, while he frantically tried to steal my company to cover his massive criminal tracks. The undeniable truth finally penetrated Patricia's thick skull. The legal document glowing on the screen was absolute and indisputable. The staggering weight of her total financial ruin crashed down upon her all at once. The arrogant, sneering matriarch, who had marched into my headquarters demanding 60% of my empire, completely vanished into thin air. In her place was a broken, destitute woman who had just lost absolutely everything she held dear in the world. Patricia let out a guttural, agonizing scream that ripped through the sterile corporate air. It was a sound of pure, unfiltered despair. Her knees buckled beneath her tailored designer skirt, and she collapsed heavily onto the polished hardwood floor. She did not care that 2 billionaire investors and my top executives were watching her epic downfall. She did not care about her pristine public image anymore. She slammed her manicured hands against the floor, sobbing hysterically like a wounded animal. She wailed loudly about her exclusive country club memberships, her luxury cars, and her elite friends who would completely disown her by tomorrow morning. She screamed at Donovan, calling him a monster, a parasite, and a thief, but her furious words were choked with heavy, uncontrollable sobs. Richard dropped to his knees beside her, looking like a hollow, empty shell of a man. He wrapped his trembling arms around his weeping wife, staring blankly at the glass table, completely paralyzed by the devastating reality that he would have to spend his final years working a minimum-wage job just to survive. They were entirely ruined, and their devastation was entirely their own fault. I watched my parents weeping on the floor of my boardroom, feeling absolutely no sympathy for their plight. They had happily signed away my life 5 years ago, and now they were choking on the bitter ashes of their own toxic greed. But the spectacular show of family delusion was not quite over yet. Caroline stepped right over her sobbing mother and positioned herself directly in front of Donovan, acting as a fierce human shield for the criminal who had just destroyed her parents. Her face was flushed with fierce, irrational anger. Instead of confronting the man who had gambled away her family fortune, she turned her vicious, glaring eyes entirely on me. She wrapped her arms tightly around Donovan, waist pulling him close as if their toxic bond could somehow protect them from federal prison. She screamed that I was a jealous, bitter liar who wanted to ruin her perfect marriage. She declared that I had fabricated the foreclosure notices and the banking records simply because I could not stand to see her happy and wealthy. She yelled at our parents on the floor, calling them weak and ungrateful for doubting her brilliant husband for even a second. She insisted that Donovan was a financial genius who was just dealing with a minor cash flow issue that poor uneducated people like me simply could not understand. Caroline lifted her chin with a sickening display of unwarranted arrogance, her eyes blazing with blind devotion. She proudly announced that I was completely wasting my time trying to ruin their glorious day. She bragged loudly to the entire boardroom that she and Donovan were completely untouchable by my pathetic corporate threats. She flaunted the fact that they were heading to the international airport tonight to catch a first-class flight to Dubai. She claimed Donovan had an exclusive invitation to an elite global investor summit in the Emirates and that they would return next week with hundreds of millions of dollars in new venture capital. She promised to buy the foreclosed mansion back in pure cash just to prove me wrong. She stood there fiercely defending a ruthless con artist, entirely oblivious to the brutal truth I was about to drop directly on her head. I listened to my younger sister fiercely defending the very monster who had just bankrupted our parents. Caroline stood there with her chin held high, wrapping her arms tightly around Donovan, acting like a brave martyr defending her true love against a jealous, bitter villain. The sheer level of her delusion was actually breathtaking. She truly believed she was boarding a luxury flight to the Middle East tonight to sip expensive champagne and watch her brilliant husband secure millions in venture capital. I could not hold it in anymore. I tilted my head back and let out a loud, ringing laugh that bounced sharply off the glass walls of the boardroom. It was not a laugh of triumph. It was a laugh of genuine, profound pity. Caroline glared at me, her face flushing a deep, angry red. She demanded to know what was so funny, shouting that I was just an unhappy spinster who could not stand to see her living a fairy tale life. I stopped laughing and looked at her with eyes completely devoid of any human sympathy. I raised the sleek black remote control and pressed the main button one more time. The massive high-definition screen behind me shifted instantly. The bank foreclosures and the offshore gambling ledgers vanished. In their place, a crisp, clean digital receipt materialized. It was an official booking confirmation from a premier international airline. I stepped aside so Caroline had a perfectly clear, unobstructed view of the massive, glowing display. "You are absolutely right about one thing, Caroline," I said, my voice echoing with a lethal, absolute calmness. "Your highly successful husband is indeed catching a flight to Dubai tonight. In fact, he booked the tickets yesterday afternoon, using the very last shreds of the cash he stole from our parents' drained retirement fund. It is a very expensive booking. 2 first-class seats on a direct red-eye flight, departing at 11 o'clock this evening. One way only." Caroline smiled, a strained, highly confused smile. She looked at the screen and then back at me as if I was simply proving her point to the entire room. She proudly pointed out that this was exactly what she had just told everyone. She insisted they were going to Dubai to save the family fortune, and that the one-way ticket simply meant they were keeping their return schedule flexible for their elite business meetings. She clung to her fabricated reality with a terrifying, desperate grip. I shook my head slowly, letting out a quiet sigh. I told her to look closer at the glowing screen. I told her to read the passenger manifest out loud for the entire boardroom to hear. Caroline turned her attention back to the massive digital display. Her eyes scanned the booking confirmation, moving down from the flight numbers to the VIP seating assignments, and finally landing on the bold black text detailing the passenger information. The room fell so incredibly silent that you could hear the heavy, erratic breathing of my parents still collapsed on the hardwood floor. Caroline's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her eyes widened to an impossible size, fixated entirely on the second name printed right beneath Donovan Hayes. She blinked rapidly, as if her vision had suddenly failed her. She stepped closer to the screen, her hands trembling violently at her sides. The name glowing in bright white letters was Brittany Jenkins. It was not some random corporate assistant or a foreign investor. It was Carolyn, maid of honor. It was the woman who had stood beside her at the altar, the woman who had been her absolute best friend since middle school. I watched the exact moment Caroline's entire universe shattered into a million irreparable pieces. "You see, Caroline?" I explained, my voice cutting through the thick, suffocating tension of the executive suite. "Donovan was never planning to take you to the Middle East. He was never planning to attend a global investor summit. And he certainly was never planning to return to the United States to buy back the foreclosed suburban mansion for Mom and Dad. Dubai does not have an extradition treaty for white-collar financial crimes. He was planning to flee the country tonight and disappear forever." Caroline slowly turned her head to look at the man she had fiercely defended just moments ago. Donovan would not meet her eyes. The arrogant Wall Street persona had completely melted away, leaving behind a sweating, cowardly criminal looking frantically for an exit strategy. He took a physical step away from his wife, creating a distance that spoke volumes. He did not deny the accusation. He did not offer a single word of comfort or explanation. His silence was the most deafening confession possible. He needed 60% of Aegis today, not to build a corporate empire. I continued driving the final nail into their collective coffin. He needed my company because he needed a massive immediate infusion of liquid capital to drain into his untraceable offshore accounts before he boarded that plane. He orchestrated this entire hostile takeover to fund his luxurious escape with your best friend. He played you, Caroline. He played you exactly like he played our greedy, foolish parents. But the absolute worst part is what he intended to leave behind, I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward my trembling sister. Donovan is a known fraudster, but he is not an idiot when it comes to covering his legal tracks. He structured his entire Ponzi scheme with incredible calculated malice. Every single one of those fraudulent loans, every second mortgage, every illegal line of credit he used to gamble in the criminal underworld, he did not sign those documents alone. Caroline's legs buckled slightly, and she reached out to grip the back of a leather chair just to keep herself standing. I pointed directly at her, my fingers steady and unrelenting. You co-signed everything, Caroline. You let him put your name on every single piece of toxic debt because you loved the status of being a wealthy investor wife. You loved signing your name on the dotted line for luxury cars and penthouses without ever reading the fine print. So when Donovan boards that flight to Dubai tonight with Brittany, he is not taking his debt with him. He is leaving $15 million of criminal debt squarely on your shoulders. The brutal, unvarnished truth hit her with the force of a freight train. She realized that Donovan had systematically set her up to be the ultimate sacrificial lamb. When the federal agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission kicked down the doors of their luxury apartment tomorrow morning, they would not find Donovan. They would only find her. When the violent loan sharks from the underground gambling rings came looking to collect their blood money, they would only find her. She was entirely alone. Her parents were bankrupt and crying on the floor. Her husband was a fleeing felon who had spent months sleeping with her best friend. And she was now legally responsible for a mountain of criminal debt that would ensure she spent the rest of her natural life in federal prison or hiding from violent creditors. She had marched into my headquarters, expecting to steal my billion-dollar empire and walk away a queen. Instead, she was walking away as a discarded bankrupt felon abandoned by the very man she had worshipped. Caroline stood completely paralyzed for a fraction of a second. The horrifying reality of Brittany and the $15 million of criminal debt finally crushed the last remaining pillar of her delusional world. A harsh, guttural sound tore through her throat. It was not a cry of sorrow or a plea for understanding. It was a raw, primal scream of absolute pure rage. She launched herself across the short distance separating her from her husband. Her manicured hands, which just moments ago had been gently resting on his shoulders, in a show of unified arrogance now curled into rigid claws. She struck Donovan across the face with a violent, open-handed slap that echoed like a whip cracking through the pristine executive boardroom. Donovan stumbled backward, completely caught off guard by the sheer ferocity of her sudden attack. But Caroline did not stop. She lunged forward again, grabbing the expensive lapels of his custom-tailored suit. She shook him violently, screaming at the top of her lungs. She demanded to know how he could betray her with her own best friend. She shrieked about the massive debt, the foreclosed mansion, and the profound humiliation he had just subjected her to in front of my billionaire investors. Her sharp acrylic nails dug deeply into his neck and jawline, leaving bright, angry red scratches across his dark skin. Donovan raised his arms desperately, trying to shield his face from her relentless physical assault. He shoved her backward roughly, his own facade of the smooth-talking Wall Street investor completely disintegrating into the cowardly thug he truly was. He yelled at her to back off, calling her a gullible, spoiled brat, who was entirely too blinded by luxury designer bags to ever question where the cash came from. He threw her own greed right back in her face, shouting that she eagerly signed every single fraudulent loan document without a second thought, because she cared much more about maintaining her elite social status than facing actual financial reality. Hearing Donovan openly admit to stealing the family wealth and ruining their lives was the final catalyst that completely shattered Patricia. My mother had been kneeling on the hardwood floor weeping over her lost suburban mansion and her vanished retirement fund. But the sight of the man who had orchestrated her total financial ruin, aggressively pushing her favorite daughter, sent a violent shockwave through her system. Patricia scrambled to her feet. Her expensive designer skirt was wrinkled, her perfectly styled hair was a chaotic mess, and her eyes were completely bloodshot. She let out a piercing, feral shriek and threw herself directly into the violent fray. Patricia slammed her fists repeatedly into Donovan's chest and shoulders. She screamed at him to give back every single penny of her life savings. She demanded he return the deed to her house and fix the massive catastrophe he had single-handedly created. She grabbed his expensive silk tie and yanked it sharply, nearly choking him as she sobbed and cursed his name. The elegant, arrogant matriarch who had marched into my headquarters demanding 60% of my empire was entirely gone. In her place was a deranged, desperate woman, violently attacking the criminal she had foolishly welcomed into her home and elevated above her own flesh and blood. Donovan was now physically fighting off both his wife and his mother-in-law. He stumbled backward, crashing heavily into one of the plush leather executive chairs and knocking it to the floor with a loud thud. He tried frantically to rip Patricia's hands off his ruined silk tie, while simultaneously dodging the furious slaps Caroline kept raining down on his head and shoulders. They were a writhing, screaming mass of toxic betrayal and absolute financial desperation. They cursed each other, spitting venomous insults and assigning blame for a catastrophic disaster they had all actively participated in creating. I stepped back smoothly, ensuring my tailored blazer remained completely untouched by their chaotic physical brawl. I crossed my arms securely over my chest and stood perfectly still. I did not intervene. I did not call my corporate security team to break up the vicious fight. I simply watched the spectacular implosion of the Foster family unfold right before my very eyes. A few feet away, my father Richard remained on the boardroom floor. He did not rise to protect his wife or his youngest daughter. He did not attempt to confront the man who had robbed him of his entire future. Richard simply pulled his knees to his chest, wrapped his arms tightly around his head, and buried his face in his lap. He rocked back and forth, letting out quiet, pathetic sobs of total defeat. He was a thoroughly broken man, completely paralyzed by the horrifying realization that his cowardice and his blind trust in a flashy con artist had left him entirely destitute in his twilight years. The contrast between the scene playing out in front of me and the grand entrance they had made less than an hour ago was absolutely staggering. The conflict had completely flipped 180 degrees. They had confidently breached my corporate sanctuary, heavily armed with a fabricated bank statement and a cheap blackmail threat, fully expecting to walk out as the newly appointed rulers of a billion-dollar federal defense contractor. They had stood united in their greed, teaming up to pressure me, laughing at my supposed weakness and mocking my independence. Now they were violently tearing each other to pieces in a public display of unparalleled, humiliating disgrace. They had willingly climbed into a pit of vipers, and now they were cannibalizing each other to avoid the deadly venom. Caroline and Patricia continued to scream and strike at Donovan while he shouted vicious, cruel truths about their shared, undeniable greed. They were rapidly destroying whatever tiny shreds of dignity they had left. My chief financial officer and the two billionaire investors watched the violent spectacle in absolute, stunned silence. They had spent decades navigating the ruthless and highly competitive waters of the corporate world, but they had never witnessed a self-destruction quite as complete and devastating as this. Vivian Ross. My attorney stood calmly by my side, her posture relaxed and her eyes sharp. She gave me a slight, knowing nod, completely satisfied with the flawless execution of our defensive strategy. I felt absolutely no pity for the people screaming and fighting on my boardroom floor. I stood there coldly observing the tragicomic play created entirely by their own unhinged greed. They had made their choices 5 years ago when they threw me out into the freezing winter night. They had made their choices again today when they decided to weaponize my trauma and attempt to steal my company. This brutal, chaotic consequence was exactly what they deserved. They had built their entire lives on a foundation of lies, manipulation, and superficial status. Now that the foundation had violently collapsed, they had nothing left but their own toxic rage to direct at one another. The sound of their screaming and physical struggling echoed loudly, bouncing off the pristine glass walls of the executive suite. It was a symphony of poetic justice, and I absorbed every single note of it. I had survived their abuse. I had outsmarted their extortion. I had reclaimed my total independence. Suddenly, a new sound pierced through the heavy, thick glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was faint at first, a distant mechanical wail rising from the busy city streets 40 stories below. The noise grew steadily louder, rapidly multiplying as more sources joined the urgent chorus. It cut sharply through the violent shouting of my mother and sister demanding immediate attention. The distinct piercing wail of police sirens echoed up the side of my corporate headquarters. The flashing red and blue lights began to reflect faintly against the surrounding glass skyscrapers, signaling the absolute end of the line for Donovan Hayes and the definitive final chapter for the Foster family. The wail of the police sirens grew exponentially louder, shifting from a distant echo to an overwhelming blare that rattled the thick glass of my executive suite. Patricia and Caroline froze mid-strike, their hands suspended in the air as the unmistakable flashing red and blue lights illuminated the pristine boardroom walls. Donovan whipped his head toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, his eyes wide with pure, unfiltered terror. He knew exactly what those sirens meant, but his panicked brain simply refused to accept that his grand escape plan had just violently crashed into a brick wall. Before anyone in the Foster family could even take a single breath, the heavy double doors of the boardroom were thrown open with explosive force. They did not just swing open gracefully, they were shoved apart by the sheer physical momentum of half a dozen heavily armed federal agents and local law enforcement officers rushing into the room. They moved with military precision, their tactical boots slamming against the polished hardwood floor. The chaotic screaming of my mother and sister instantly died, completely silenced by the overwhelming presence of federal authority entering my corporate sanctuary. "Federal agents, nobody move!" The lead agent shouted, his voice booming with absolute command. He flashed a golden badge clipped to his tactical vest, his sharp eyes immediately scanning the room and locking directly onto the sweating, bleeding man in the custom-tailored suit. Patricia let out a high-pitched shriek and scrambled backward, crawling away from Donovan as quickly as her designer skirt would allow. Caroline stood completely paralyzed, her hands raised in the air, her face pale and streaked with ruined makeup. Richard remained curled on the floor, too broken to even look up at the armed officers surrounding his ruined family. Two heavily built agents closed the distance to Donovan in a fraction of a second. Donovan instinctively raised his hands, stepping back and stammering out a pathetic string of legal threats. He tried to puff out his chest and project the arrogant Wall Street persona one last time, shouting that he was a highly respected venture capitalist and that they were making a massive jurisdictional mistake. The agents were entirely unimpressed by his flashy suit and his bleeding nose. They did not hesitate. One agent grabbed Donovan's right arm, twisting it sharply behind his back, while the second agent shoved him forcefully against the very same glass conference table he had tried to steal from me. The impact forced the air out of Donovan's lungs in a loud, harsh gasp. He squirmed and kicked, trying desperately to break free from their iron grip, but he was completely outmatched. The sharp metallic clicking sound of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed through the silent boardroom, signaling the absolute end of his criminal empire. Donovan pressed his bruised face against the cold glass, struggling to breathe. "Madeline," he choked out, his voice laced with blind panic. "Tell them to stop. Tell them this is just a private family dispute. We were just negotiating a business deal. Tell them." I slowly uncrossed my arms and took a deliberate step forward. I looked down at the pathetic, squirming man pinned against my table. I smoothed the lapels of my blazer, projecting nothing but cold, lethal authority. I did not offer him a single ounce of mercy. I pressed the federal security panic button hidden under my desk the exact second you threw that fabricated blackmail USB drive onto my table. I explained, my voice perfectly steady and echoing clearly across the room. I did not just call the local police, Donovan. I alerted the federal cybersecurity task force protecting this facility. They have been listening to every single word of your pathetic extortion attempt for the last 30 minutes. The lead agent stepped forward, pulling a folded document from his tactical jacket. Donovan Hayes, he announced, reading from the official paper. I am executing a federal arrest warrant issued directly by the Securities and Exchange Commission early this morning. You are being taken into federal custody for multiple counts of wire fraud, massive securities fraud, and operating an illegal Ponzi scheme across state lines. The agent looked up from the paper and glared down at Donovan. And thanks to your spectacular performance today, we are officially adding the federal extortion of a classified military contractor to your rapidly growing list of severe felony charges. You are looking at decades in federal prison. Donovan's entire body went completely limp against the glass table. The realization that the Securities and Exchange Commission had already finalized his arrest warrant before he even stepped foot inside my building utterly destroyed his last remaining shred of hope. He had walked into a meticulously designed federal trap, and I had gladly locked the door right behind him. He squeezed his eyes shut, fully aware that his luxury flight to Dubai, his stolen millions, and his arrogant lifestyle were permanently gone. Vivian Ross stepped up beside me, crossing her arms and looking down at the arrested criminal with a sharp, victorious smile. You really should have done your legal due diligence, Mr. Hayes. Vivian noted, her tone dripping with pure professional sarcasm. Extorting a civilian CEO is a standard felony. Extorting a defense contractor actively protecting national security infrastructure is practically an act of domestic terrorism. I highly suggest you save whatever breath you have left for your public defender. The agents hauled Donovan up from the glass table, roughly spinning him around to face the doors. He looked absolutely wretched. His designer tie was torn and stained, his face was scratched and bleeding from Caroline's frantic attacks, and his hands were securely bound behind his back. The arrogant, smooth-talking corporate raider had been entirely stripped of his power, leaving behind a terrified, exposed fraudster. As the agents began to march him toward the exit, Caroline finally snapped out of her paralyzed state. The reality that her husband was leaving her to drown in $15 million of criminal debt ignited a blazing inferno of pure, unadulterated hatred. She lunged forward, her face contorted with violent rage, her voice tearing through the air in a piercing shriek. "You lying, pathetic piece of garbage!" Caroline screamed at the top of her lungs, spitting the words at the man she had fiercely defended just moments prior. "You ruined my life. You stole my future. I hope you rot in a federal cell for the rest of your miserable existence. I hate you. I hate you." She tried to launch herself at him one last time to inflict another physical blow, but a police officer quickly stepped into her path, holding her back with a stern warning. Caroline fought against the officer grip, her face a mask of ruined, smeared makeup and absolute desperation, screaming a continuous stream of vicious curses and vile insults at her husband back. Donovan did not even turn around to look at her. He kept his head bowed in total defeat. His shoulders slumped as the heavily armed agents shoved him through the heavy double doors and out into the brightly lit executive hallway. The elevator chimed, signaling its arrival, and the agents marched him directly into the steel cab. The doors slid shut, cutting off the sight of the handcuffed criminal and sealing his dark fate forever. The heavy double doors of the executive boardroom clicked shut with a solid, definitive thud, cutting off the final echoes of the police sirens and the chaotic shuffling of tactical boots. The sudden, profound silence that descended upon the room was heavier than concrete. Caroline stood entirely alone in the center of my corporate sanctuary. Her chest heaved with rapid, uneven breaths as the adrenaline that had fueled her violent outburst against Donovan rapidly drained from her veins. In its place, a cold, suffocating wave of absolute terror violently crashed over her. The golden child of the Foster family, The woman who had spent her entire 29 years floating on a cloud of unearned privilege and toxic arrogance was finally plummeting back down to earth at terminal velocity. She looked down at her trembling hands. Her flawless acrylic nails were chipped and stained with the blood she had drawn from her husband's face. The massive diamond engagement ring, catching the harsh fluorescent light, suddenly looked less like a trophy of elite wealth and more like a heavy iron shackle chaining her directly to a federal prison sentence. The horrifying reality of her situation began to render in her mind with brutal, agonizing clarity. She had lost the flashy husband she had proudly paraded in front of her socialite friends. She had been intimately betrayed by Brittany, the maid of honor she had trusted with all her shallow secrets. But far worse than the emotional devastation was the lethal financial catastrophe permanently attached to her legal signature. $15 million of toxic criminal debt currently rested squarely on her shoulders. She remembered all the times Donovan had casually slid thick stacks of legal paperwork across their marble kitchen counter, telling her to simply sign on the dotted line to secure their next luxury vehicle or secure their next penthouse lease. She had signed every single document without ever reading a single word because she was entirely too addicted to the effortless, wealthy lifestyle he provided. Now those careless signatures were going to summon ruthless federal prosecutors and violent underground debt collectors directly to her doorstep. She was completely, utterly, and terrifyingly bankrupt. Caroline's legs gave out. She collapsed onto the polished hardwood floor, her designer silk dress pooling around her in a ruined, wrinkled mess. The fake theatrical tears she had weaponized earlier in the meeting to manipulate my investors were completely gone. In their place, genuine, raw, hysterical sobs violently ripped from her throat. She gasped for air, her entire body trembling as she looked around the ruined boardroom. She saw her father, Richard, still curled in a pathetic ball of defeat. She saw her mother, Patricia, staring blankly into the distance, thoroughly destroyed by her own greed. There was absolutely no one left to save her. No wealthy parents to write a magical check. No smooth-talking husband to con their way out of consequences. Slowly, Caroline lifted her tear-stained face and locked her terrified eyes onto me. I was standing tall and perfectly composed, my tailored blazer entirely immaculate, my posture radiating absolute untouchable power. I was the chief executive officer of a billion-dollar federal defense contractor. I had the unlimited financial resources to make her entire nightmare disappear with a single phone call to my banking team. I was her absolute last lifeline on the face of the planet. Caroline scrambled across the hardwood floor, dragging her ruined dress behind her. She reached out with shaking, desperate hands and grabbed my wrist, her fingers digging into my skin with frantic urgency. "Madeline." She choked out, her voice breaking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine. "Madeline, please. You have to help me. You have to save me from this." I looked down at the woman who had spent her entire existence making me feel like an insignificant piece of garbage. I felt absolutely no warmth, no pity, and no sisterly obligation. I simply stared at her frantic, tear-soaked face, observing her breakdown with the detached fascination of a scientist studying a microscopic insect. "Please, Madeline," Caroline begged, her grip on my wrist tightening. "You have billions of dollars. You can hire the best defense attorneys in the country. You can pay off the loans before those violent people come looking for me. I will go to federal prison, Madeline. They will lock me away, or those underground criminals will kill me. We are sisters. We share the same blood. You cannot just stand there and watch your own flesh and blood be destroyed like this. Please, I am begging you. I will do anything." I looked at her desperate, clutching fingers. I smoothly and forcefully yanked my wrist entirely out of her grasp. I took a deliberate step backward, breaking the physical contact completely. I smoothed the fabric of my sleeve, maintaining my cold, calculating demeanor. "You burst into my company an hour ago to steal my life work," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal quiet pitch that echoed flawlessly across the silent room. "You stood right there and mocked my independence. You bragged about your massive diamond ring and told me I was a bitter, lonely spinster who needed your criminal husband to save my failing company. You laughed in my face while attempting to ruin my entire future. But we are family, Caroline sobbed, reaching out for me again but falling short. We are sisters. You have to help me. I tilted my head slightly, a cold, humorless smile touching the corners of my mouth. I remember a very different conversation from 5 years ago, Caroline. I remember you standing in the hallway of our childhood home, perfectly safe and protected, while Mom and Dad threw me out into a freezing blizzard to take the blame for your drunken hit and run. I remember you watching me lose everything. I took another step back, looking down at her miserable, collapsed form. You proudly told everyone today that the older sister must always sacrifice for the family, I stated firmly, throwing her exact toxic words right back into her face. You said I owed you. You said I needed to step up and take the fall for the greater good of the Foster legacy. I shook my head slowly, my eyes burning with absolute, unforgiving authority. No, Caroline. I sacrificed everything I had 5 years ago. I paid my dues to this toxic family in full. Today, you finally get to face the real world entirely on your own. I am not paying a single cent to save you from the disastrous life you so happily and eagerly signed up for. You made your terrible choices. Now you can clean up your own trash. Caroline let out a devastated, agonizing wail, dropping her face into her hands, as the finality of my rejection completely crushed her spirit. She curled into a miserable ball on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably as her golden fairy tale life permanently burned to the ground. Before the echoes of her crying could even settle, a new sound broke the tension. From the far side of the ruined glass table, another figure began to move. Patricia, thoroughly stripped of her elite socialite arrogance and her manipulative pride, dragged herself across the polished floor. My mother crawled desperately on her hands and knees, her expensive clothing ruined, her face stained with tears. She shuffled frantically toward me, reaching out with trembling, desperate hands until she violently grabbed hold of my ankle. Patricia's hands clamped onto the hem of my tailored skirt with the desperate, frantic grip of a drowning woman. Her knuckles were stark white, her expensive diamond rings digging sharply into the luxurious fabric of my suit. The woman clinging to my ankles was completely unrecognizable from the arrogant, impeccably groomed matriarch who had stormed into my executive boardroom less than an hour ago. Her designer mascara was running down her cheeks in thick, dark tracks. Her carefully sprayed hair hung in chaotic, sweaty strands across her face. She looked up at me from the polished hardwood floor, her eyes wide, bloodshot, and brimming with a pathetic, terrifying panic. "Madeline," she wailed, her voice cracking into a hideous, guttural sob that reverberated against the glass walls of the suite. "Madeline, I am so sorry. I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong about everything. Please, you have to listen to me. You have billions of dollars now. You have military contracts and endless operational capital. You are the only one who can fix this massive disaster." She buried her tear-stained face against my legs, completely abandoning whatever tiny shred of dignity she had left in her hollow life. "Please," my mother begged, her words rushing out in a frantic, hysterical stream. "You have to pay off the bank. You have to buy back our house for us. You can clear the terrible debts Donovan left behind with a single simple phone call to your accounting department. You cannot let the bank throw us out onto the streets. We will have absolutely nowhere to go. We are too old to start over, Madeline. We cannot be homeless. You cannot do this to your own parents." A few feet away, Richard finally found the willpower to lift his head from his knees. The sight of my father was equally repulsive. His face was blotchy, soaked with cowardly tears, and his expensive suit jacket was severely wrinkled and ruined. He dragged his heavy body across the floor, entirely abandoning the shattered remains of his golden child, Caroline, to join his weeping wife at my feet. "Madeline, sweetheart, please listen to your mother." Richard sobbed, his voice high-pitched and trembling with raw, unadulterated fear. "We made a terrible miscalculation. We trusted the absolute wrong man. But we are still your family. We raised you from a child. We provided for your upbringing. We are begging you to show some basic human mercy. A few $1 million means absolutely nothing to you now. It is literal pocket change for a massive federal defense contractor. But it would save our entire lives. Please do not let us die in abject poverty. Do not let us freeze on the cold city streets. The sheer unmatched audacity of their sudden pleas echoed loudly in my ears. They were actually begging me for financial salvation using the exact same terrifying circumstances they had mercilessly subjected me to half a decade ago. They were crying uncontrollably about the horrifying prospect of freezing on the streets, entirely forgetting the brutal winter night they had viciously locked me out of my childhood home without even a winter coat. They were sobbing heavily about being homeless and destitute, completely ignoring the undeniable fact that they had happily forced me to sleep on roach-infested floors and skip meals just to survive my 20s. I stood perfectly still, allowing them to weep and beg and thoroughly humiliate themselves in front of my highly respected investors, my chief financial officer, and my sharp corporate attorney. I felt absolutely no warmth spreading through my chest. I felt no sudden surge of filial loyalty or buried familial obligation. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of cold, clinical detachment. I was looking down at two complete strangers who had accidentally burned their own lives to the absolute ground out of sheer, unadulterated greed and monumental vanity. Slowly, I bent down at the waist, bringing my face closer to Patricia's sobbing, ruined features. The familiar scent of her expensive floral perfume was completely overshadowed by the sharp, bitter stench of her nervous sweat and unfiltered panic. I reached out with my right hand. My movements were smooth, deliberate, and entirely unhurried. I placed my thumb and index finger over Patricia's tightly clenched hand. I applied a firm, unrelenting physical pressure, prying her index finger backward, breaking her frantic grip on the premium fabric of my tailored skirt. She let out a sharp, desperate gasp, trying fiercely to hold on, but I possessed a cold, steady physical strength she simply could not match. One by one, I peeled her trembling fingers away from my clothing. I uncurled her middle finger effortlessly. I pulled back her ring finger, feeling the cold, sharp edge of her diamonds scraping harmlessly against my skin. I forcefully detached her grip entirely, letting her hands fall uselessly back onto the polished hardwood floor. I smoothed out the slight wrinkle her desperate clutching had left on my skirt, ensuring my corporate armor remained absolutely flawless and completely untouchable. I crouched down slightly, leveling my gaze directly into her wide, bloodshot eyes. I did not blink. I did not offer a single microscopic expression of sympathy, comfort, or understanding. My face was an impenetrable mask of pure, solid ice. Patricia stared back at me, her chest heaving violently, her mouth hanging open as she desperately searched my eyes for any lingering trace of the obedient, desperate daughter she used to expertly manipulate. She was frantically looking for a tiny shred of the girl who used to deeply crave her maternal approval. She was searching for the broken teenager who would have sacrificed anything to earn a single word of genuine praise. She found absolutely nothing. The deep, vast emptiness she saw in my eyes finally communicated the absolute devastating truth to her. There was zero love left for her to exploit. There was zero familial guilt left to weaponize against me. The emotional bank account she had carelessly drained for 33 years was completely, irrevocably, and permanently bankrupt. "You are asking me to save you from the freezing streets," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly, perfectly articulated whisper that sliced cleanly through her pathetic sobbing. "You are begging me for mercy because you are terrified of having absolutely nothing and nowhere to go. You want me to use my hard-earned wealth to magically erase the horrific consequences of your own toxic, greedy decisions." I stood back up to my full height, towering ominously over the two kneeling, broken figures on my executive boardroom floor. I crossed my arms securely over my chest, my posture radiating an untouchable absolute authority. The allotted time for begging had expired. The time for listening to their fabricated excuses and their pathetic pleas for unearned financial salvation was officially over. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the crisp, heavily air-conditioned air of the executive suite fill my lungs. I prepared to deliver my final definitive verdict. I was entirely ready to look down at the cruel people who had shattered my youth and hand them the exact same agonizing, irreversible pain they had so casually handed me 5 years ago. I looked down at the two pathetic figures shivering on the polished hardwood floor of my executive boardroom, Patricia and Richard Foster. The people who had brought me into this world were now reduced to nothing but hollow, empty shells of their former arrogant selves. They stared up at me with wide, terrified eyes, waiting for a miraculous pardon that was never going to come. I let the absolute silence of the room stretch out for several agonizing seconds. I wanted them to feel the crushing weight of my authority. I wanted them to understand that the immense power dynamic had completely and permanently shifted. They were no longer the judge and jury of my existence. I was the executioner of theirs. Vivian Ross stood quietly by my side, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp, watching the spectacular downfall of my abusers with deep professional satisfaction. The two billionaire investors who had witnessed this entire chaotic ordeal simply leaned back in their heavy leather chairs, completely mesmerized by the absolute iron will I was displaying. They knew they had invested their capital in a chief executive officer who could not be broken by anyone. 5 years ago, I began my voice ringing with a terrifying crystalline clarity that left no room for interruption or debate. 5 years ago, you dragged me out of my bed in the middle of a brutal Chicago winter. You did not let me grab a winter coat. You did not let me put on proper boots. You physically shoved me out the front door into the freezing snow because I refused to go to the police station and ruined my entire life for a spoiled drunk driver. Patricia opened her mouth to offer another pathetic, fabricated excuse, but my piercing glare instantly silenced her. I had absolutely nothing in my pockets. I continued stepping closer so my shadow completely enveloped her trembling form. I had no money. I had no shelter. I was terrified and freezing. And right before you slammed that heavy oak door in my face, you looked me dead in the eyes. Do you remember exactly what you said to me, Patricia? Do you remember the exact words you used to sever our bloodline forever? My mother swallowed hard, her face draining of whatever color she had left. She remembered. I could see the exact memory flashing behind her bloodshot eyes. You told me that I was a useless waste of space, I said, articulating every single syllable with razor-sharp precision. You told me that I was an embarrassment to your pristine social standing. And then you said those unforgettable words. You said those who fail do not belong in this family. Richard squeezed his eyes shut, unable to bear the heavy, crushing guilt of his own cowardly complicity. Caroline, who was still sitting slumped against the glass wall, let out a quiet, miserable sob, completely shattered by the reality of her impending federal nightmare. I stood perfectly tall, straightening my spine and looking down at the broken people who had tried to destroy me twice. Today, I am officially returning that exact sentence to you. I declared, my voice booming with undeniable lethal finality. You walked into my fortress today, expecting to conquer my empire. You expected to steal my hard-earned wealth, to cover up your own catastrophic mistakes. You thought you could simply bully me into submission because you still viewed me as that freezing, desperate girl on your porch. But you were wrong. You are the ones who failed. I pointed a steady, manicured finger directly at Patricia and then at Richard. You failed as parents. You failed as human beings. You failed to protect your own retirement because you were entirely too blinded by greed and superficial status. You allowed a flashy criminal to rob you blind because you valued a custom-tailored suit over actual substance. You are the ultimate failures, and you absolutely do not belong here. I did not wait for their inevitably pathetic responses. I did not care to hear another fabricated apology or another desperate plea for unearned financial salvation. I simply raised my hand and signaled my chief financial officer, who was standing quietly near the entrance. He immediately pressed the heavy silver button mounted on the wall near the double doors. Within seconds, the heavy doors of the executive suite swung open. A team of 4 highly trained corporate security guards marched into the room. They wore sharp black suits and earpieces, moving with strict military efficiency. They had been waiting in the hallway ever since the federal agents had dragged Donovan away, entirely prepared to clear out the remaining toxic debris from my headquarters. "Escort these individuals out of my building," I commanded, my voice entirely stripped of any remaining emotion. "They are permanently banned from this facility. If they ever attempt to step foot on this property again, you are to immediately press charges for criminal trespassing." The security guards did not hesitate. 2 massive guards stepped forward and firmly grasped Patricia by her upper arms, lifting her roughly off the polished hardwood floor. She let out a wild, hysterical shriek, kicking her legs and thrashing against their iron grip. "Madeline, no!" She screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with pure, absolute despair. "Please, Madeline, you cannot do this. We are your parents. We have nothing left. Please do not throw us out. We will do anything." The guards ignored her frantic screaming, dragging her forcefully toward the exit. A third guard hauled Richard up by his suit jacket. My father did not fight back. He offered no resistance whatsoever, simply letting his head hang in total humiliating defeat as the guard pushed him firmly toward the doorway. He was completely broken, utterly destroyed by the realization that his comfortable, wealthy life was permanently over. The fourth guard approached Caroline. My younger sister did not even attempt to stand on her own. The guard had to grab her by the elbows and haul her to her feet. Caroline stumbled, her expensive designer dress torn, and ruined her face, a terrifying mask of smeared makeup, an absolute hollow shock. She looked at me one last time, her eyes wide with the terrifying realization that she was walking out of this building to face a mountain of criminal debt and an impending federal investigation completely alone. "Get your hands off me!" Patricia continued to screech, her voice growing hoarse as the guards dragged her backward through the heavy double doors. "Madeline, you ungrateful monster. You cannot leave us like this. We are your blood." I stood my ground, watching the chaotic, miserable procession with a heart made of solid ice. I did not blink. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I simply watched the heavy oak doors slowly swing shut, completely cutting off their desperate, flailing bodies from my sight. Even after the doors closed, I could still hear them. Their frantic wails and desperate sobbing echoed loudly down the pristine marble hallway of my corporate headquarters. The sounds grew fainter and fainter as the security team dragged them toward the service elevators, forcibly removing them from my world forever. I listened to the pathetic cries of the people who had tried to ruin me completely fade into nothingness. The toxic burden I had carried for my entire life was finally gone, leaving behind a profound, deafening, and incredibly beautiful silence. 6 months have passed since the day the heavy oak doors of my executive boardroom slammed shut on my toxic family. The spectacular collapse of the Foster family and their fraudulent son-in-law did not just make local news. It became a highly publicized national scandal. The federal authorities did not waste a single second tearing apart the intricate web of lies and stolen money that Donovan had recklessly woven. The justice system operated with brutal mechanical efficiency, delivering the exact consequences I had promised them. The federal trial for Donovan was a remarkably swift and entirely humiliating affair. The Securities and Exchange Commission partnered directly with federal prosecutors to dismantle his entire criminal enterprise piece by pathetic piece. They presented the fabricated financial documents, the offshore gambling ledgers, and the sheer volume of stolen retirement funds to a highly unforgiving federal judge. Donovan's arrogant Wall Street persona completely evaporated in the courtroom. He sat at the defense table looking small, weak, and thoroughly terrified. When the judge finally slammed the heavy wooden gavel down, the sound echoed with absolute finality. Donovan was sentenced to a mandatory 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for wire fraud, corporate extortion, and operating a massive interstate Ponzi scheme. There would be no early parole for good behavior. He was immediately stripped of his custom-tailored designer suits and forced into a standard-issue scratchy orange jumpsuit. The flashy con artist who honestly thought he could extort a highly classified military contractor is now locked inside a tiny concrete cell. He spends his miserable days staring at a heavy steel door, completely stripped of his freedom, his wealth, and his fake elite identity. Caroline learned the devastating reality of unconditional loyalty to a criminal. Because she had eagerly co-signed every single fraudulent loan and fake mortgage to maintain her lavish lifestyle, the federal government and the aggressive underground creditors held her entirely legally responsible for the massive $15 million deficit. The authorities ruthlessly seized absolutely everything she owned. They repossessed the luxury cars, confiscated her designer handbags, and auctioned off her massive diamond engagement ring to pay back a tiny fraction of the stolen money. Today, the former golden child of the foster family lives in a cramped, dilapidated studio apartment in one of the most dangerous and rundown neighborhoods in the city. To avoid the violent debt collectors and to barely scrape together enough money for her monthly rent, she works the grueling graveyard shift as a cashier at a dingy 24-hour gas station. Her pristine, expensive manicures are completely gone, replaced by cracked, bleeding cuticles and rough, calloused hands from scrubbing dirty linoleum floors at 3 in the morning. She wears a stained polyester uniform instead of silk dresses. She spends her 15-minute breaks crying uncontrollably in a bleak storage room, entirely abandoned by her wealthy socialite friends, who instantly blocked her phone number the second the scandal broke. My parents suffered a fate that was arguably worse than federal prison for two people so utterly obsessed with superficial status and elite appearances. The bank officially foreclosed on their sprawling suburban mansion exactly as the eviction notice had promised. They were given 48 hours to vacate the premises. Their prestigious country club memberships were instantly revoked, and their wealthy friends pretended they did not exist, actively crossing the street to avoid making eye contact with them. With their entire life savings completely drained to absolute zero by the son-in-law they worshipped, Patricia and Richard were forced to pack whatever meager clothing they could carry into cheap plastic garbage bags. They eventually moved into a tiny, rusted aluminum trailer in a cramped, decaying mobile home park on the far industrial outskirts of the city. Patricia spends her miserable days sitting on a cheap plastic folding chair outside her cramped trailer, bitterly complaining to neighbors who do not care to listen. She wears faded thrift store clothing and eats cheap canned soup, a far cry from the lavish catered charity dinners she used to proudly host. Richard was forced to take a minimum wage job working as a front door greeter at a local hardware store. His spirit is entirely broken, and he frequently has to endure the supreme humiliation of welcoming his former wealthy colleagues who visit the store and look at him with undisguised pity. They are completely destitute, stripped of their immense pride and drowning daily in the agonizing regret of knowing they violently threw away the only daughter who possessed the power to easily save them. As for me, I am currently standing in my brand new, heavily fortified executive office located deep inside the Pentagon. The Department of Defense officially relocated my primary operational headquarters to Washington to better integrate the Aegis platform into the national security grid. My company is now the undisputed cornerstone of the federal cybersecurity infrastructure, operating with a valuation that has soared well beyond my wildest initial projections. I hold a warm ceramic mug of premium dark roast coffee in my hand, feeling the soothing heat seep comfortably into my palms. I take a slow, satisfying sip, looking out through the thick, bulletproof glass window at the stunning panoramic view of the nation capital. The bright morning sun reflects beautifully off the Potomac River, signaling the start of another highly profitable and impactful day. My corporate empire is absolutely untouchable. My brilliant executive team is thriving under my leadership, and my legal counsel, Vivian Ross, continues to dominate the corporate sector with unmatched ferocity. I do not have a single ounce of toxic burden weighing down my shoulders anymore. The dark, heavy shadow my manipulative family cast over my life for 33 years has been permanently eradicated by the blazing light of my own relentless ambition. I am completely, undeniably, and irreversibly free. I take one final look at the beautiful historic city skyline, smiling deeply as I set my coffee mug down on my pristine mahogany desk. Sometimes forgiveness is not about reaching out your hand to save someone from the raging fire they intentionally started. Sometimes true forgiveness is simply about turning your back, walking away, and letting karma finish the job. Society often dictates that family is everything, and that blood ties demand endless forgiveness. Madeline's journey brutally shatters this dangerous illusion. When the people who are supposed to protect you become your most ruthless abusers, you owe them absolutely nothing. True loyalty is earned through mutual respect and consistent support, not demanded through toxic manipulation and sheer entitlement. The most profound takeaway from this ordeal is the transformative power of radical self-reliance and ironclad boundaries. When her parents and sister threw her out into the freezing snow, Madeline did not surrender to their cruelty. She channeled her agonizing pain into building an impenetrable fortress of success. She teaches us that hitting rock bottom can actually serve as the perfect concrete foundation for a billion-dollar empire. By refusing to let her toxic past dictate her brilliant future, she reclaimed her entire identity. She proves that walking away from abusive environments is not an act of cowardice, but rather the ultimate display of monumental courage. You are never obligated to set yourself on fire just to keep your abusers warm. Furthermore, this narrative highlights the undeniable reality of natural consequences. You do not always need to plot elaborate revenge against the people who broke your heart. The greedy, the vain, and the arrogant will inevitably destroy themselves with their own reckless choices. Madeline did not bankrupt her parents or force her criminal brother-in-law into a federal penitentiary. Their own insatiable greed and pathetic superficiality orchestrated their spectacular downfall. Sometimes the most powerful response to severe betrayal is simply stepping completely aside and letting karma finish the job. Have you ever had to draw a hard line and walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace? Share your story in the comments below and hit the subscribe button for more empowering journeys of survival and ultimate justice.